And I think we are live now. So, hello, everybody, and welcome to Why Read. Today, I have a very special guest, Sarah from Sarah Reads. How are you doing, Sarah?
I'm doing very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing good. Just want to make sure. I hope I don't have another window open. Let me just double check because I would hate to have an echo. I think we're good. All right. So, thank you, everybody who's already here in the chat. I wanted to invite Sarah actually to episode 4, which was the one with Mike's book reviews, who's here in the chat. And yeah, very nice of him to stop by here. And with, let's see, who else was there? Jake Bishop. And
Mhm.
unfortunately, Sarah couldn't make it to that one. And we tried to postpone and do this again several times, and it didn't quite work out. And so finally, we just decided we're just going to go ahead and do a one on one discussion rather than a group discussion just to make it easy on Sarah and me. And I think it's not unprecedented. We did have Alan on episode 1, and
Mhm.
I'm one for not making rules on BookTube. So
That's the best way to do it.
exactly. So Sarah, we always have to start off with the question, which is why read? Why does Sarah read?
This is an excellent tongue twister. This is like have you ever seen people do the Dr. Seuss challenge where they read the Fox and Socks book and you have to read it without like slowing down and just like make your way all the
Oh,
way through?
I've
Yeah.
never done that before, but I love Dr. Seuss, so
Do you? It was a big thing. It was probably just on like the section of Instagram that like parents hang out on. But a couple of years ago, it was like a big thing where all of the parents were doing it and seeing who could like make it all the way through without any mistakes. So it's a good tongue twister. But yes, why read? Why do I read? I feel like everybody thinks that's a hard question, but I think my answer comes to light in that I read a lot of different things because I read for a lot of different reasons. So I think it depends on what I'm reading. The goal is different based on what genre comes out. And so recently I've been reading mostly fantasy, which is my first bookish love. And I think a lot of the time in fantasy, I'm reading for entertainment value and I'm reading for that sense of adventure, sometimes escapism, depending on how, the world is going, but also to help explore ideas about other cultures, stretch imagination. When I'm reading literary fiction, sometimes it's if I want to give myself a challenge. If I'm reading sci-fi, it's because I feel like I've just thought too much of myself lately and need to be humbled because I don't understand a lot of what happens in sci-fi. But it really just depends on what I'm reading and when. But there are lots of different things that reading brings to me.
yeah. Well, speaking of which, I know that you've been doing that sci-fi series on reading classic sci-fi books, and just I like that series, and I like what you had to say in your last review because I think a lot of people who come to fantasy, we tend to think of ourselves as more character-driven readers, but there are
Mhm.
different types of storytelling, and in that book that you reviewed by Ursula K. Le Guin, that was there were characters, but the characters served more of a narrative purpose for the themes she was exploring rather than us relating to the characters in a deep personal way.
Absolutely. And I do find that with sci-fi and classic sci-fi definitely, but even modern sci-fi. Like if you read I don't remember the name of the series. Is the series Remembrance of Earth's Past, the one that starts with the three body problem? That's very similar. I have only read the first book. I read it, I don't know, a few years ago for sure, like maybe 4 years ago. But it very much the characters in that book as well, I feel like are more vehicles to drive the plot forward or to help expand some of those ideas. And what you're focusing on is the big ideas because that book is full of big ideas.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, I really want to read that trilogy. I've
Mhm.
been seeing people talk about it, and I keep thinking, that sounds so good. And everybody keeps on raving about the second book being way better than even the first book. So I'm curious where that goes. Um, but yeah, I love what you said about because I feel the same way. I do. More so lately, I've been reading a lot more other genres than fantasy, and I find different reasons pull me into different books. And I like that. I like to keep expanding my palette in a way.
Mhm.
Do you consider yourself a mood reader?
I do, which is what has made booktube a little tricky, and it actually is where one of my resolutions for the channel for this year came from. So I found last year I was trying to make these TBR lists. And it was for a couple different reasons. So number one, they usually perform pretty well, which it's nice to see, especially since I do try to put in like a lot of reviews in my content, and I do some like content that makes me really happy that is not really big crowd pleasing content. And so it's nice sometimes to put out a video that a lot of people want to watch. And the TBRs are like a staple video. So I didn't really want to get rid of them. I also had agreed to do a lot of buddy reads last year, which meant that there were a lot of buddy reads on the TBR. And as the year went by, I didn't get into a reading slump. That doesn't happen to me very often, but I found myself just ignoring the TBRs and then feeling a little bit bad because I think I had set up a bit of an expectation with the people who were watching them, being like, this is the content I can expect from Sarah. This is what these are the books that I can expect to discuss with her or hear her talk about. And then I wouldn't read them. And then I would feel bad for not reading them. I didn't want to feel bad. So I don't want to end up making videos that make me feel bad. I want to make videos that make me feel good. And so one of my goals for this year was to limit my TBR videos to 5 books per video, because on average, I read anywhere from 8 to 10 books a month, which again has been like the standard pre-booktube. I don't feel like I'm pushing myself to do that or anything. I just am boring and don't have a lot of other hobbies. So that's what I end up doing with most of my time. But it allows me to mood read a little bit more, which I need to do. It was making me feel very stifled last year.
Yeah, well, I think that's pretty healthy to do some mood reading. And I think TBRs, we can all relate, are highly aspirational for many of us. Yeah. And so Matt here, he says, thanks for hosting this, Joanna. It's got to be a little intimidating talking with Sarah because she comes off so ridiculously intelligent and well-spoken. I mean this in the nicest way possible. Well, I have to say that this is something I love about you, Sarah, because you are very intelligent and all of your videos are an inspiration to me to get better at my verbal skills and to learn more about what I'm reading about, of course, to do more refined reviews and that kind of thing. But also, Sarah is just one of the most down to earth, kind people that you will meet in this community as well. So I think that you have like the perfect balance there. So I don't feel intimidated talking to Sarah because she's such a true friend and such a wonderful person. But I can understand that too. If you didn't know Sarah and watched her videos, because wow, he just speaks so well in your videos. Is that something that you've always had? Like you've always had a really strong skill with talking?
Well, thank you. First of all, I feel like the lighting is going to show me blushing, like even worse now that I'm in the dark basement. But thank you. I talk a lot for work. Obviously, I do a lot of talking. I think it's something that I always felt comfortable doing. And I don't know, I did like a pretty silly video, like a fun, silly video with my daughter a couple of days ago and put that up on the channel. And we're very similar. So she's also very like outgoing. She's bubbly. She likes to talk. And I was a lot like that when I was younger as well, which is funny because my son is a lot like my husband, who is very much more like shy and a little bit closed off. So I don't know if he'll ever make an appearance. He'll have to decide if he wants to do that. So I had a comfort and a confidence, which I guess was was inspired by my parents. Like they were very supportive and very interested in anything that I had to say, which is important to kids to know that they can talk and the people that they talk to are listening and find the things that they have to say worth listening to. And then I just had a lot of practice. So I did a lot of things that were related to talking, I guess, throughout high school. I did a lot of like oral competitions, mostly in French, actually, which was more difficult because that's my second language. So getting up and talking in front of people in another language is much harder. So I think then it made feeling like speaking English was much easier. And then for work, I have to talk a lot. So in medical school, even if you don't become a psychiatrist, from the very first week of medical school, they make you film yourself. So in clinical skills, you get your own little tape recorder at the beginning, or at least in my medical school, that's what they did. And you have to film yourself. You get used to listening to the way that your voice sounds, how you talk, how you approach patients. And in the beginning, it's just to make sure that you can develop people skills so that you have good bedside manner, you can see what you're doing, maybe evaluate your physical exam. But if you decide to go into psychiatry, like I did, those filming sessions become a lot longer because now you film yourself interviewing patients for a half an hour and then 45 minutes and then an hour. And you have to go back and rewatch that tape. And the way that you speak in psychiatry has to be purposeful, because there's a lot of language that can be very harmful to patients. There's a lot of topics that are very sensitive, and you have to learn how to approach them in a way that is empathetic and compassionate, but also very clear, because it's very possible that the person you're speaking to will have disorganized thinking themselves, and it's going to be difficult for them to understand if you don't word things a certain way. So I think, or at least I try to be very clear, but not get garbled down in a lot of really, I guess, like words that are not going to be accessible for everyone. And hopefully that's what happens in the videos too. Like, I don't want them to feel like they're only aimed at people who read their books with the thesaurus next to them. Like, hopefully they will be clear, but not feel, too elevated.
No, I think you have that balance for sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Matt was mentioning that he needs room for more non-booktube hobbies or books. Sorry, I need to find room for my non-booktube books. Yeah, I was going to ask you actually about hobbies though. So you started piano from what I understand. So I wanted to ask you about how that's going.
It's going well. I'm really bad at it, which is fun because it makes me want to get better. And it's interesting to go in. My son started at the same time. So as I said, he's really shy. So we were thinking of ways that we could help him gain some confidence without having to push him into doing things in front of other people. Juliet, for example, is in theater, and she's been in a bunch of plays already. She gets up on the stage. She's the kid that they sent out during the Christmas concert to tell jokes in between sets, when everybody else was getting dressed. So Isaac was very scared to even be in the Christmas concert. So we wanted to get him a hobby that could maybe help him foster some of that confidence, but not feel directly in the spotlight. And so we thought, he really likes music, so we thought piano would be a good option. He loves music without lyrics. So especially video game playlists, he will listen to, if his dad plays a video game, even if it's not appropriate game for Isaac, they'll listen to the soundtrack together. Like God of War, for example, has a really beautiful soundtrack with a lot of instrumental music. And even though he wouldn't be allowed to play or watch the game, he really likes listening to that with his dad. So he started piano, and I thought he was also shy to meet his piano teacher and go in and go to somebody's house and feel like he was in a new space. So I said, we'll start together. And his lesson is at 5:30, I think, and mine is at 8. So we can kind of compare what we're learning and talk about it and then practice. And it's been really fun. I really, really like it. I was getting really confident, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to turn on this metronome and practice. And then I was like, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me. Does anybody play with this going? I have no sense of rhythm. This is going to end in disaster, but it's been really fun.
Piano is hard. I have a hard time with piano. I'm not very good at it. So and Alan's being mean.
Alan's always mean.
He is always mean. He's very mean.
I will say I have an advantage for piano. I have, and this will become evident in my video that's going to go up tomorrow. I have giant hands, and I don't show them a lot on camera because I feel like they look freakishly large, because they are. And you'll see tomorrow, because there's a lot of putting my hands on books, and they're giant. So spanning the keys, very easy.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah, because for me with an octave, I just I cannot do it. I'm trying to get there.
That's one good thing.
Yeah. And I loved your video with your daughter too. Oh, that was so precious. She was talking about some kind of doll with heads that come off or something like that.
They're truly awful. So she loves them. I have a lot of thoughts about children's toys in general, but these LOL dolls, very odd. The design choice, the clothing that they give them, but everybody likes them, and she likes them, so I'm happy enough for her to play with them. But they're creepy, but also they're just odd. They're not my favorite toy, but she has a good time.
Yeah, I was curious. my niece is really into dolls as well, so yay.
Yeah, kids love it because it has that unboxing portion, right? So they come in a ball. But as you open it, there's different sections of the sphere. So as you unbox it, there's little shoes that will come out and little clothes and, everything. Alan just comes here to bully me. And then he makes videos saying that I'm a bully. And because he has such a big following, people believe that.
I know. Yeah,
It's awful.
he's pretty horrible. Yeah, he's defending himself now too.
Yeah, this is true,
Yeah,
Alan. I do.
mouth plans. It's funny. So what are you reading right now, Sarah?
I am reading Senlin Ascends, which unfortunately I can't talk about because I told Alan I wouldn't talk about any of these books.
I tried to tell Alan the other day that I saw you and that you told me all about your feelings about guards. And he
Mhm.
didn't believe me. He's like, "No, you
Believe
should
you.
and Joanna." I was
It's
like,
good.
"Darn it." You're right. She didn't tell me, but I just wanted to torment him a little bit. Yeah.
That's
So
awesome.
so you're reading stuff, man, and I can't ask you about it. Darn it.
Let's see, what else have I read this month that I had that didn't come from Alan? So I was finishing up a web novel series, which I've read a series by the same author and really liked last year. So I was finishing up one of those. I haven't read it yet, but I just they don't fill up. But there's a lot of whale toys in this home, more than there should be, because there should be zero, but there are many. So, but I just picked up Stoner from the library, and I'm really excited to read that because I liked Augustus so much. And I picked up The Doors of Eden from the library by Adrian Tchaikovsky because I have only read 3 things by him so far. Ogres, which I read for Alan this month, and I read Guns of the Dawn, and I read Children of Time, and they're all so different. And it's
Yeah.
amazing. So I want to read more just to see how much range does he actually have. It's very impressive.
It sounds like he has a huge range as an author. I've only read Guns of the Dawn, but I thought the writing was very good in that book. It fit
Mhm.
the tone and it felt very accessible at the same time. And he has like he had an efficient way of writing as well. So even though it read very easily, it felt like he was very economical with his words. And I felt like I couldn't read it too fast, otherwise I'd miss something. So I liked his writing style quite a bit, but then hearing everybody describe Children of Time and his sci-fi books, his Shadow of the App series, is that his series? I think.
Yep.
Yeah, it just sounds like what can he not do? Adrian
So he
Tchaikovsky.
has so many novellas, which is great because it's hard to read so many 600-700 page books a month. So having someone who can write novellas, and if there is that same range amongst them, actually that's not true because I read another one of his novellas last year, Compliments of Alan, and that was Elder Race,
Oh
I
yeah,
think. Yeah.
yeah,
So also very cool. I think the one thing that threads them together is you can tell. There we go. Alan says also Elder Race. That's true. You can tell that he has a background in the humanities because there's always a lot of really interesting cultural exploration in his books, which is something that I really like and you don't get from a lot of fantasy authors. I think a lot of the world building we get often focuses on history or magic, and sometimes that cultural piece can be lacking. Not in a bad way, because you often, like, unless you were looking for it, you might not even notice that it's not there. It's not until you start to read some authors who do focus on that that you realize how cool it is to have it included. And I found that with Tagana as well. Have you read Tagana?
I haven't yet. No.
So also really some interesting world building by Guy Gabriel Kay. He focuses a lot on like art and food and what that means for a population, what gives you your cultural identity. And you don't see that as much in fantasy. Not that you don't, but it's not as prevalent as, a well fleshed out magic system or the history of the land that you're in. And it's always fun to see that kind of stuff.
I love that. I think that sounds fantastic. Yeah, I'm gonna have to read more of his works, maybe some novellas.
Mhm.
I'm really curious what you'll think of Stoner by John Williams, because speaking of an author who has a lot of range, and I've only read those 2 books, I've only read Augustus and Stoner, but just from those 2 books alone, I feel like you just see a very wide range compared to what he does because they're such opposite types of stories.
Yeah. And apparently he pulls them both off really well.
Yes, I think so. I do think so.
That's like
Yeah.
he has a Western as well. So if I do like Stoner, I'll probably want to read that one. So I'll let you know when I'm
Yeah.
reading it, and maybe you can pick it up too.
Yeah, Alan and I were talking about we're gonna pick that up together, so maybe the 3 of us can read that. Yeah,
Awesome.
Butcher's Crossing. Yeah. I'm very excited about that because I've discovered last year, I think I'm a fan of Westerns, at least so far, the ones I've read, so, I'm pretty
Yes, because
excited.
you're a Red Country fan too, right?
Yes, I am. I
Oh,
love
that's
Red
another
Country.
thing I'm reading right now, Joanna. I started last night. I started The Trouble with Peace. So There we go.
Oh,
Alan
yeah.
skipped the lesson on sharing
Oh,
friends.
is the Trouble with Peace, is that the second one? That's the second one, right?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so excited. I've heard nothing but huge praise for that trilogy. I haven't gotten to it yet. I did start the audiobook of Sharp Ends, just
Mhm.
the first short story, and then I ended up getting distracted by some other audiobooks, so I need to come
Mhm.
back to it at some point. But I'm very much looking forward to that because oh no, Alan, no way. Alan DNF'd the blade itself.
No.
Oh.
That's sad. That's really
I
sad,
didn't
Alan.
know that, Alan. I didn't know that. We'll have to hear all about it. I'm sure
I'm
he's
sure we will.
yeah.
I'm
I'm
sure
really looking forward
we
to
will.
him. Yeah, I'm really
So,
looking
Alan,
forward to him.
will you now just, like, skip everything else and go to the Age of Madness? Are you that kind of person?
Yeah, you're gonna have to let us know. Wow, I'm really surprised. But I have heard that the Age of Madness is better for what it's worth. So
And it
yeah.
focuses on different things and the kinds of things that I think Alan would like, so
Well, this is a kind of karmic thing.
there we go. That's my justice is
Yeah.
coming.
And I see Kevin. He's reading The God Is Not Willing. That's Stephen Erickson's. It's a Malazan book after the 10 books, and it's the Witness trilogy. I want to reread that one this year because I have the audiobook to it, and I read it physically last year, but I want to reread it before the second book comes out. That's pretty cool, Kevin. Can't wait to hear your thoughts on that. Yes, Philip, Alan is being naughty, Alan. That is a new identity here. Oh, he didn't DNF it. What? Are you lying to us then? Okay.
I'm still
Okay. Slowly reading it. That doesn't count as
Mhm.
DNFing. Okay. Awesome. Yeah, so I do need to continue with Abercrombie. I love Abercrombie's writing. I've heard fantastic praise for that trilogy. So that is going to be high on my list this next year of series that I want to complete. And yeah, we'll see when I get to it. Um,
He's just
another
so funny. He's so
who's
funny. Abercrombie, he
yes,
makes me laugh so much.
yes. That is the number one thing that I read Abercrombie for, if I'm honest, is that he
Yeah,
makes me laugh like more than any other author, probably.
absolutely. And certainly any other living author. He, I think, is the funniest person writing fantasy right now. If anybody else has any other suggestions, I'm happy to hear them. But I have not found someone who is still writing now that is as funny as he is.
Yeah. I don't know if it's supposed to be as funny as I'm finding it to be, but right now I'm reading Shogun by James Clavell,
Mhm.
and I've just found it so funny, like so many times, like the cultural clashes and
Mhm.
things. I don't know. I don't know if I'm supposed to be finding it funny, but I've just been laughing out loud several times while reading it. I didn't expect that, and I didn't expect it actually has a pretty accessible writing style, and I'm so glad because the book looks scary.
It's just it would
Huge.
need to.
It is huge, but yeah, it's a lot of fun so far.
And is it historical fiction or is
Mhm.
it just like narrative historical nonfiction?
No, it's historical fiction.
Okay.
Yeah. It's kind of swashbuckling, especially at the beginning because we have pirates and yeah, it feels very fun. I don't know, it's just a fun story so far, but I mean, I'm sure it'll get more emotionally intense as it goes on, I imagine.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
I'm sad that I could not read that. I had a lot of things to read in January, but I will be listening to everyone's thoughts.
Yeah, well, I'm going very slowly. I mean, I all I've read in January is that, and well, one third of that, and my
Mhm.
reread of A Game of Thrones, and a couple of audiobooks. But so it's pretty much dominated my TBR more than I thought it would. Yeah.
Awesome. I'm doing a reread now. So as you talk, I'm remembering more of the books that I'm actually reading. So I'm doing a re-listen of Jane Eyre. I downloaded the audiobook because I read the book Wide Sargasso Sea. It was the first book that I read in January, which is it's not a retelling of Jane Eyre. It's a reimagining of one of the characters in Jane Eyre and providing for that character a backstory that they did not have in the classic. And it really made me want to reread Jane Eyre. So the audiobook is free on Audible. It's one of their Audible exclusives. So I downloaded it. And it's reminding me why I loved Jane Eyre so much when I read it like 15 years ago or whenever
Aw.
that was.
I've not read any Jane Austen. It's one of my Yeah, I'm so embarrassed by how ill-read I am with classics, like very ill-read. So I haven't read any Austen yet, but
That's Charlotte Bronte, but
oh,
that's
the
okay.
Bronte, the Brontes. Well, that's how ill-read in classics I am. I don't even know who wrote that book. So,
No, it's
yeah, I
easy
don't
to
even
get
know who
them.
wrote
It's
Jane
easy to
Eyre.
get them mixed up. It's a good one, but it's very beefy. So some of them, at least Jane Austen, some of her books are slimmer and they're a little bit more accessible in that way. I think Charlotte Bronte's style is a little bit more fluid than Jane Austen's. And it could be just because Jane Eyre is more gothic. I think the only other one that I've read by Charlotte Bronte is The Professor, which I think is hers. It's
Hmm.
hard. Sometimes I mix up her sisters and I'm not sure which one has written which book. But her writing's a little more fluid, I think, than Jane Austen's. So it just depends on what you're looking for. But the gothic part also makes it very compelling in Jane Eyre because it's kind of creepy and you're wanting to go on and see what happens. And it's good. It's a good classic for fantasy fans, I think, because it
Uh,
does have that gothic kind of horror element.
yeah, yeah. I'm sure I would enjoy every classic I read, I end up enjoying. So
Mhm.
I don't really have a good excuse for not reading more classics. Uh,
Do you ever find when you're reading classics, this is something we talked about on Discord when we were reading Wide Sargasso Sea. Do you ever find that the process of reading them, as you're reading it, you feel a certain way about it. And then when you have finished, those feelings kind of evolve. Like sometimes when I'm reading a classic, I'm going slowly because it's difficult to acclimate to the change in structure, sentence structure. And I'm trying to understand and put things into historical context and realize why things are written a certain way. And then when I finish the book, I feel like I have more positive feelings about it in general than at any point during the read, if that makes sense.
100%. Yeah. Yeah. And I know a lot of people are against, I don't know if this is true about a lot of people, but I hear now and then people say that they don't think that people should, or that that the English curriculum in public schools and high school should require so many classical books because it burns people out of reading or it makes them not like reading. And I don't know if I agree with that, specifically because I had the worst English education in high school, like the worst. My English teacher in high school, because I didn't take honors in AP English, if I had taken those levels, I probably would have had a better English education. I probably would have been more well read when it comes to classics. But I
Mhm.
took regular English, and one of my English teachers was a retired football coach and a retired high school football coach. And I think we watched Grapes of Wrath. I don't think we actually read it.
That's amazing.
It was really sad. And then I had another English teacher, and I remember I wrote my autobiography, which was so bad. I'm sure it was very poorly written. And she gave me like an 800 out of 600 points. It was such a great autobiography. I don't know. It was just so bad. So I had the worst English education in high school you can imagine.
Mhm.
But I feel like every classic book that I was able to read, those books I don't remember the experience of being like I'm flipping through this book having this amazing experience, but I do remember, like I remember for example a summer when I read Frankenstein,
Mhm.
just having discussions on what we read every single day in class and being so into the discussions. And I found myself completely loving the book. And I don't know that it would have been the same if I had just read it on my own, if I hadn't been forced to engage and think about it and discuss it on a daily basis.
In that way. I have
Mm.
definitely had that experience, but in university. So in high school, in the Newfoundland curriculum, you don't read a lot of classics. You read there's so many requirements. So you read like a work of Newfoundland literature, a work of Canadian literature. I don't think we read any books that would be considered American classics or international classics, I guess. But when I was in university, I did an English minor with my French major. And so I did do some courses and if you have a good teacher, it makes a big difference. I read books for sure that I was not enjoying. And then when he would get up and talk about them, I loved them. So this happened to me with Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy, who in a video I recorded, I kept calling Tom Hardy because I guess I was thinking of the actor Tom Hardy.
Oh,
I went back and watched it. I was like, sorry, Thomas. But I didn't super enjoy the process of reading that book. I think because I didn't have a lot of the historical or cultural context. And then when this professor, who was He was an amazing professor. My husband and I did this class together, which is a funny story in a different way. But we did this class together and he was excellent. The professor was so good. He was so smart. He cared so much. He ran a very like Socratic style classroom. There was a lot of questioning back and forth. It was great. And he made me appreciate the book for reasons that I would never have known to appreciate when I read it by myself. So I definitely agree. But I think maybe at least starting with some books that will grab people's attention, and then as they progress, maybe adding in some classics that they could then discuss and get some of that benefit from would be helpful.
Yeah, yeah. But I'm with you. I actually, and yes, Alan, I have met that character, and I thought that character was hilarious. Yeah, I can't say more than that. It's amazing though. Yeah, but I also find like what you said about your feelings evolving after you finish a book with classic literature. I find that way for myself with a lot of books though too that are not just classic literature. I find myself just over time thinking about a book and realizing, I don't know if I like that book as much over time, or I like it more. You know, it varies, and I think that's part of for me also just part of booktube too. Like sometimes if I didn't really connect with the book, I try to listen to people give positive reviews of the book to see if it shifts my way of thinking about the book a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Usually it doesn't, but but I try that. I mean, sometimes it has, but you know, or I listen to the opposite. If I loved a book, maybe listen to people who didn't love it as much and reasons why. But but yeah, I think that for me, it's always there's the experience of reading the book when you're reading it, but there's also a whole entire journey of absorbing the book, of absorbing the impact it has long after reading it.
Absolutely.
Which is why my top 10 list for my top 10 breeds last year was so unexpected. Like I thought so many other books were going to make that list.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so shocked how much it changed over time. And then you were talking about TBR videos. Like I felt also kind of weird because on my top 10 list, so many of my books were books that I picked up on a whim. They weren't
Mm-hmm.
even books I'd really planned. So that was kind of the interesting thing.
It's the plus of mood reading.
Yeah. I hope you enjoy it, Madison. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Let's see. A lot of people loving classics here in the chat. And Philip says, I think I like Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte the most of all the Brontes. I hear about this one all the time, Wuthering Heights.
It's also
And I think
excellent.
it's also a little divisive too. I hear some people say they don't love that one as much.
It is,
I
and
have
I
a
think
feeling
it
like,
depends on when you read it and what you expect from it. I read Wuthering Heights in high school, not for school, and went into it with a very high school perspective. I think expecting like a love story, and what I got, I was like, this is horrible. Why would anybody
yeah,
want to read that? And then I went back and reread it as an adult and viewed it through a different lens and really, really loved it. So I think sometimes it's what you're expecting to get from it.
yeah. Yeah, I think that's probably true. Let's see. What is Joanna literally throwing hands at me right now?
When you said people should read classics in high school.
Oh no! I guess you did mention that, Alan. Some people say, well, it's not just Alan though. I've heard a lot of other people say it. I feel like that's a common conversation. Alan, you speak for the people. I'm just the weird hipster here. But I say that just because, like I said, I wasn't forced to read all the classic books that everyone else was forced to read. And I feel very embarrassed about it now. I feel like kind of the outcast because I wasn't forced to read it. But who knows? Alan might be right, and I might hate reading if I were forced to read him. You
That's
know,
true.
who
You wouldn't
knows?
even have this channel if
It's
they had
true.
forced you into it.
Yeah, it's possible. It's possible. Let's see. Catching up here. Sorry, I'm so behind in the chat. I'm always behind in the chat.
It's hard to do both, talk and sort through the chat.
It is, yeah. It's a little bit challenging here. I sort of wish no one would teach Beowulf in high school when I teach it at the college level. Most of my students had to, yeah. You know, so I did read Beowulf in high school, And my teacher who taught, I feel like all my teachers sound so funny, but my English teacher who taught Beowulf, she was this old woman who wore Wranglers and cowboy shirts, and she was a chain smoker, and she had this permanent scowl on her teeth, in her mouth, and she just looked like she just had enough. She's like, rah.
Sounds like you grew up in a sitcom. What kind of teachers you had?
I really could write a book about the funny teachers I've had. Oh my goodness. But she was like, yeah, we're going to read Beowulf now. And I know none of you read it because all you have senioritis. And I did. I read it and I did enjoy it. I didn't remember anything about it, but I did reread it a couple of years ago. And then I watched Philip talk about it with Andy Smith at the time. And Philip obviously is amazing at teaching in general, but his explanation of that book, of that poem, or however you want to define it, Christian lament, as he put it, is incredible. It took my appreciation for it to a new level, for sure. And I did really enjoy it. It's pretty cool. I do think, a lot of people, try to, I can understand how if you're expecting maybe a modern type of dragon slaying story, that might not be as appealing. But I guess there's something cool for me. I guess that's what's cool to me about classic literature too, is you could just to sort of put yourself in that time frame and imagine what the story might have meant to the people when it was written, and just thinking of the history of the document and how it survived over time. I don't know. I just find all that brings a different energy to me when I'm reading a story like that. So Sarah, what kind of things are you enjoying in books right now?
I'm trying to, like you said, I'm trying to diversify in terms of this year. So prior to coming to BookTube, because the thing that brought me to BookTube was wanting to get back into reading fantasy, which is something that I hadn't done for a long time. So I felt like I was really behind, or uninformed, I guess, because it's not any kind of race, but I was really uninformed about what was new in fantasy, what was good in modern fantasy. And so when I came to BookTube, both as a watcher first for the first year, and then once I got onto BookTube, everything was very fantasy centric because I was catching up and I was loving it. Fantasy is my favorite. So once I got caught up in that, I didn't want to stop reading any of it. And there were so many good books that people were talking about. But I would like to still read all of the other genres that I really enjoy. And so this year I'm trying to be a bit more intentional in picking up books that are outside of fantasy while still mostly focusing on fantasy, but getting to sprinkle in a little bit of the classics, some contemporary lit, some historical fiction, and going from there. So that's what I'm looking for, is to be a little more intentional with my non-fantasy reads.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. When it comes to fantasy specifically, and maybe this is affected by that, by kind of diversifying your genre, maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
Has your taste in fantasy, I'm sure it's shifted over time since you were younger, but do you feel like your taste in fantasy has gone through any shifts since starting a channel?
I think I was not prepared for the depth of modern fantasy when I started the channel, because I had read classic fantasy and to be honest, like a lot of the same books over and over, because I grew up in such an isolated area. We didn't even have a library. And so I mostly read my dad's books, which he had, a good collection of fantasy, I guess, but it's still limited in what you can fit in a house. So I read the same books over and over a lot, and then went to university and read different things other than fantasy. And so when I came back in, I was not expecting, like I said, the depth that I found there, because most of the books that I read and loved when I was younger were very European centric. They were very male focused, and I didn't mind those things. I didn't ever grow up as a young person thinking, and this might sound bad, I don't know, like thinking like, oh, I wish there were more girls in Lord of the Rings. Now that I'm older, I can look back and say, it would have been really nice to get a female perspective. Or I can look back, for example, on The Gunslinger, which is one of my favorite series. And I think about things that I never used to. So I'm very intrigued, for example, by Roland Deschain's mother. Like, I wish that I knew more about her. She's such an interesting, conflicted character. And she is the catalyst for a lot of the events that happen in the story, but we also don't get to see her make any of the decisions. We don't get to see any of her agency. And those are some of the things that as I have gotten older that I really wish I could have had, even though at the time they didn't bother me. I don't think that reading books that were mainly focused on male characters had any impact on my like level of confidence or how much I identified with fantasy or any of those things. It's fine if a young girl growing up did have that experience, but I didn't ever feel that way. But I was pleasantly surprised when I came into modern fantasy and saw how much there was to offer in terms of exploring different cultures. The way the magic had changed was a big thing that I'm probably not the biggest fan of. Like, if that's the biggest con to modern fantasy from my perspective, I'm not a huge fan of these very delineated mechanical magic systems, but they have their place. And, there are some people who really love them, and I appreciate that. But just the cultural exploration, the female focused stories that we get, exploring a variety of genders, sexual identities, like all of those things are things that I got in very small doses in the classic fantasy that I read. And it was an event. Like, if I read a book that was from a female's perspective, it was memorable and it became one of the things that I really obsessed over. And I don't want to talk about it too much because this book is mired in like a ton of controversy, and it's not a book that I have ever reread. But The Mists of Avalon was a big experience for me when I was younger. It was hugely influential, which makes it really sad that I don't want to go back and reread it and I don't want to talk about it. But reading a book like that was focused on female characters was huge when I was younger because there wasn't a lot like that. And coming into modern fantasy, there's so much to choose from, which is great. It's, it makes it very exciting to come back into the genre after so long and see some of the things that are available.
Oh, I can relate to that completely. In fact, I read some of Lord of the Rings. I didn't totally finish it. I didn't finish Return of the King when I was a teen. But of whatever fantasy I read back then, in addition to that, I wasn't conscious of the fact that it was so male centric. Like, I didn't really think about it one way or another. And I don't think it was until I picked up A Song of Ice and Fire a little over 10 years ago that it hit me. I'm like, I don't even know if it hit me right away, but I was like loving it so much. And then I suddenly realized there is in-depth female character work in this story. We get several female perspectives, not just one. And I think that completely blew my mind that was possible. I don't know. I think I was looking for that all along, and I didn't even realize that I never felt like I saw myself enough in stories. And it always made me wonder why I was struggling with fantasy compared to a lot of my male friends at the time. But yeah, it's really strange. But even now, though, a few things about that. One is that I got back into reading fantasy. I took a long break after that, and then I got back into reading fantasy before starting my channel. I found out about this whole booktube culture and stuff around 2016, 17, around then. And around then, I mostly found, it was kind of funny. I actually found out about booktube through Daniel Green's channel because I was watching the Game of Thrones series and he did a whole review on Game of Thrones. And then I realized, oh, there's this whole part of YouTube. And most of what I found at the time were young adult fantasy booktubers because those people had huge channels.
Definitely.
So I thought that was most of what booktube was. I hadn't found anybody like, of course, you and Alan and Philip and, your channels. And so it was interesting because I did start to get into YA fantasy at that time. And I knew I was an older audience for that genre, but I didn't really mind because so much of YA fantasy is more female centric, I would say, than adult fantasy. And for me, I think it kind of, I don't know, for me, it fulfilled something in me, like the time I missed that I didn't have, because YA fantasy didn't exist when I was a teen. So in a way, it kind of filled up this longing I had that I never got when I was younger. And it also fulfilled that desire for more female perspectives.
Absolutely. And we can't discount the influence that YA fantasy has had on adult fantasy. Like that has certainly trickled through the success of, and everybody has their opinions on Twilight, but the success of that as a paranormal romance, we see that in so much of the adult fantasy that we get now. And I think YA fantasy has shown the market, which unfortunately is what drives a lot of what gets published and then what we have available as options to read. It shows them that books from different perspectives are viable. And so I think that YA authors definitely deserve a lot of credit for putting in the work of publishing things that were not traditionally published and making them more mainstream. And again, like that doesn't mean that everyone's always going to want to choose those books. There's going to be some people who want to stick with their classic fantasy, the tropes that they're comfortable with, the books that feel like childhood to them. And that's great if that's what you like to read, but it's wonderful that everybody gets options now. Like there are all kinds of stories get to be published, and publishers know that all kinds of stories have a place. So I really like that. And I will always admire YA authors for that reason. And I agree. I think that you get a lot of that female perspective in YA, and it's very rich there.
Yeah, absolutely. I have no regrets about going down a YA rabbit hole for a while there, because I feel like a
Mhm.
lot of it, there's also a lot of diversity and representation in YA. I would say a little more so than fantasy, though modern fantasy is evolving and you see more of it in modern fantasy these days.
Mhm.
But I feel like YA set the ground, actually. It went further first.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
they set the standard for sure.
So I have no shame in that, even though I'm not really as crazy about YA these days. Um, I would be curious to hear from you. Like, do you have anything? Because I feel like a lot of people associate YA with certain tropes. Do you
Mhm.
think that there is anything that delineates YA from adult in your mind, aside from just love triangles, which is I think what most people associate YA with?
So for me, I will classify something as YA if it is a story about adolescence.
Mhm.
So, and if it's a story about discovering something that is important to adolescence. And this is what will separate, for example, Assassin's Apprentice from something that is YA. So Assassin's Apprentice takes place from Fitz's perspective when he is an adolescent. It is during that time period that would typically show up in YA novels. But what the book is a reflection of Fitz as an adult, looking back on the things that he did as a child and how they influenced him as an adult. It's not an exploration of his teenage years. It's not the themes of the book are they have a coming of age element, but it's not, the purpose is not to help the reader explore things that are pertinent to adolescence. It's a bigger story in that way. And so that is how I look at YA. And it's interesting because I think a lot of booktubers, and especially a lot of fantasy booktubers, because there was because there were limited female perspectives, as we said, in classic fantasy, not they were there, and it's just that I didn't have access to them, so I didn't know about them when I was younger. But looking back now, like you do have Barbara Kingsley, I think her name is, who Sanderson was a big fan of, and we have Patricia A. McKillop, and like there's a bunch of female fantasy authors who were doing things in the 60s, 70s, 80s. It's just I didn't have access to those books, so I didn't know about them. But I think because of so much of what was mainstream was male centric, I think there is a tendency for booktubers to read something that could be female focused with a very accessible writing style and label that as YA. Whereas they can read something that is male focused with the same accessible writing style and think of that as adult. And I think that just comes from this bias of reading a certain kind of story and associating certain things with a certain age range. But for example, I've never heard anyone call the dragon, well, actually, it's not a good example because she's a female author as well, but she does use initials, which I think sometimes people don't realize she's a female author. But the book Dragon Mage, which is from a young boy's perspective, I thought that was YA. That felt YA to me because it's about adolescence. It's about discovering who you are and what you're capable of. So it felt very YA to me. But there are other books that I will read. For example, a recent release that I just read called The Daughters of Izdahar. It's a debut novel. It was fantastic. I did a review about it. I'm going to put it up next week because I thought it was excellent. But it has a very accessible writing style. and two main female characters. And I will not be one little bit surprised if I hear it described as YA, or people saying like it felt kind of YA, like I liked it, but it was kind of YA-ish to me. And I think that term YA-ish gets thrown out there when books are female focused and accessible. Like I don't think people are going to call a lot of what Brandon Sanderson writes YA because it is written by Brandon Sanderson. When some of the books do focus on adolescence, I don't think they're YA. I wouldn't classify them as YA, but similar books that follow people through similar phases of their lives, written by female authors or starring like a mostly female cast, sometimes do get, I'm going to call it typecast, even though it's not a movie, but they do sometimes get lumped into that YA pot. And for me, it's not about the writing style. It's not about the tropes. It's not about the author. It's about thematically what we are trying to explore. And if thematically that is about adolescence or what you learned during that time period or how you are going through this kind of period of momentous change, then that is YA to me.
That's such no, that was excellent. That was so well said. I love that. Thank you so much for answering that. I haven't thought about this in depth, and I haven't thought what I would need to do is I would need to go through stories that are female centric, that are following a female protagonist in coming of age, and seeing how that's explored, and maybe compare the two. But whenever I think of a coming of age story from a male perspective, I think you're dead on, by the way, about the fact that a lot of times, like for example, with Farseer, we have a framing narrative actually, and we're seeing how that informs who Fitz is as an adult. But I also feel like with a lot of the stories of male coming of age, there seems to be a similar thing. And like I said, this could be the same with female, and I just need to explore it more deeply. But I feel like there's this push towards like the male growing up really fast, like faster than being robbed of an adolescence. So for example, not to give away anything too much, but in Dune, for example, if you want to think of Paul's character, Ender's Game, I even feel like there might be a push with that character too, to grow up fast. But I feel like that's something that I see a lot of, where the male character has to almost skip over adolescence in a way. And I feel like that's actually true to a lot of how males probably feel in our society too, when they're, teenagers. Or I think it was true at one time. I don't know if that's still true, where men feel like they have to grow up really fast to be a man kind of thing. Yeah. So I guess I'm just curious about that.
No, it is. And it's a fun topic to think about. And it's a nuanced conversation. Like, and it's hard to talk about, because I think there's always going to be like a little bit of defensive, like, posturing, because people don't want to feel like they're dismissing something or that they're overlooking anything. And I think a lot of what we do and a lot of what we say is subconscious. And it's not until someone looks at it and points it out that we can reflect on it and think, why did I say that? And why did I feel that way? Because we often don't reflect on the things that we say. They're just out there. And sometimes when it's on the internet, you don't get that option to just haul it back in, which I think everybody deserves that option, because we can all say things without reflecting. That is, it's part of the impulsivity of humans. But it's hard when it's on this kind of platform, because it's out there. And especially if it's like this, if it's in a live setting, you don't often get that period of time to reflect on why you think something is the way that it is. But it's interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm like I said, I haven't thought about it deeply as far as like female perspectives, but I know like that was something coming up in my thoughts when I thought about a lot of like male coming of age stories. But it is interesting, because I noticed last year when I was reflecting back on everything I'd read last year, and I didn't read any YA fantasy at all last year. I think I read maybe one or two books that were considered possibly YA, but I read so many books, even by female authors, that were based on male characters or male coming of age or male perspectives. And I thought that was interesting. I was like, wow, it just worked out that way. So I don't know. It was just something I noticed, and I was thinking I probably should balance that out a little bit. So I'm probably very skewed in the books I've read, and I guess we all are, right?
And it depends on what subgenres you like as well, because there are certain subgenres of fantasy that are more female dominated, like paranormal romance, or those kinds, like fairy tale retellings. There are certain spheres of fantasy that are more female dominated, and then you have like grimdark and epic fantasy, which there are female authors, but it's certainly more male dominated.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought it was interesting because like I read Hob last year. I just read
Mhm.
Farseer trilogy, and we follow a male character in first person. And then I read Jenny Wirtz for the first time, and in both books I read from her, they followed male perspectives.
Yeah.
And usually it was a duo of male perspectives, but
And it
but
would be interesting. I would love to talk to Robin Hobb and ask her if that was something she felt like she needed to do when she was publishing Farseer and Assassin's Apprentice. Like she published them as Robin Hobb, which is a gender neutral name. I think many people probably assume that Robin Hobb is a man before they know who Robin Hobb is. Like none of us would do that because we know who she is. But it's an easy thing to assume. And then was she conscious of selecting fits or creating fits as a male character because that was something that was going to sell better, or something that was going to be more appealing to people who traditionally read fantasy, or the group that was thought to traditionally read fantasy at a time when the book was coming out? And maybe not, who knows? It's just an interesting question. It's something that's worth asking. Does she wish that she could have had a female at the center of her stories? Did she like writing from the male perspective because it flexed like some writing muscles that it's harder, obviously, to write as someone who identifies as a different gender than you, because you don't have that experience, you don't have that context. So I imagine it's more challenging. And Robin Hobb is really talented, so she probably enjoys a challenge. But it's an interesting question. It would be nice to know. It'd be fun to know.
that would be really, and I would be curious to learn that about Hob as well. I talked with one author last year, Michael R. Fletcher.
Mhm.
He's a published and self-published author, and he said that he does. I hope I'm remembering this right. So, Michael, if you watch this, I hope I got this right. So I might be getting this totally wrong. But he said he did something like gender swapping when he wrote. So he'd write a character in one gender and then flip the gender and see how that would turn out, so that maybe, and I guess the hope behind that is that the female character, if you wrote it as a male character and then flipped it to female, for example, then the female character wouldn't be flat, if that makes
Right.
sense. So I
Interesting.
thought that was an interesting idea
It's
too.
a fun writing exercise.
Yeah, and I mean it's so hard because we all have like our biases without realizing it. It's unfortunately just something that we all have to overcome.
And I think
So
that's something that's hard on the internet, because there's not a lot of room for acceptance in people learning how to express themselves, or how to show that their thoughts on a certain topic may have evolved, or how to learn from mistakes that they might make. The internet is a very definitive place. I think in a really early video that I recorded, I said, everyone's a Sith on the internet. Like you're either with me or you're against me. Like there's not a lot of room for gray, which I think is what makes YouTube a nice place, or BookTube a nice place, because we're so focused on finding that, like following characters who are morally gray, watching or reading about people who are fully realized humans who make mistakes and have to grow from those mistakes. So I think that we have a little bit more capacity to have that forgiveness and be able to approach things with that outlook. But it can be tricky. It's hard to have, like, certain conversations that would be really worth having are sometimes hard to have on the internet, because you have to be so precise about what you say, and sometimes there's not a lot of room for flexibility, which makes things difficult.
that does make things difficult because I feel like it's just a matter of how things are. Like, I mean, the way people thought about culture
Mhm.
and about identity, um, these social norms 10 years ago isn't the same as how they think about it today. And
Yeah.
chances are they're not going to be the same 10 years from now. And if we have a video that's posted on the internet reflecting our views now, chances are they're going to be outdated someday.
Absolutely.
And I agree. There just has to be room for that. I always thought that that was something that would make that makes authors very courageous in a way because,
Hmm.
their works are gonna be published and maybe someday they'll look back and realize they wrote things in a way that maybe they wouldn't write them the same way if they wrote it now. So I think that's always gonna be a challenge for people, but I love what you said because I would hope that's the case, especially with fantasy and so many redemption arcs.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So Von Roycroft says that Juliet Marillier has been doing great female perspective in fantasy for decades, YA and adult. So
Absolutely. And I can't believe I did not read her until the year before last. I
yeah,
I
yeah.
loved the Daughter of the Forest. It was so, so good. So good.
I need to read that. Have you read any of her other books yet?
I
Or
haven't. I really was dragging my heels on continuing because I know some people enjoy the rest of that particular series. Just most people do seem to prefer the first book. And then Evie read them and she was like, these are horrible. Save the feelings that you have for Daughter of the Forest and don't read any of the other ones, which made me a little bit nervous. And I do want to know how I feel about them, but I'm also okay sitting with the Daughter of the Forest for a little while. Sometimes the things that you really love, I feel like it's hard to want to move on from them. And this is the problem that I have had with Robin Hobb. It has taken me so long to read her books. And I think it's just because I like them so much more than almost anything else I read. And then there's not going to be any left. And it's just hard to
yeah,
continue on.
yeah. I can understand that. That's that feeling of just never wanting the journey to end.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I sometimes feel like I sabotage myself in that way. So Varsha wrote that she had a very similar trajectory to me, starting with Daniel. I think that's pretty common for a lot of us.
I think so.
Daniel Green seems to be a starting point for a lot of us, and then there are some huge YA booktube channels out there. Like somebody was mentioning Cruise Project. That was definitely one that I followed back in the day.
I still follow her. I find her videos. I love her reading vlogs. I
Mhm.
find her life so interesting. Just I know a really strange thing to say, but all the things that she seems to really like and be good at are things that I am not really good at. So it's fun to watch them.
Her reading vlogs, you mean, or what do you mean by
Yeah,
that?
her reading vlogs because she does other things in them like decor type things and like cooking, and it just seems like so homey and cozy. And I am not that person, even though I would sometimes like to be. I'm going to show you. I'm going to see if I can bring this up without playing it because it would be really embarrassing. My introduction to BookTube, I'm looking at the video right now, was 10 years ago. I was in my first year of medical school and I wanted a hobby. So I decided I was going to make some videos and put them on YouTube. So I actually have 3 BookTube videos from 10 years ago that are locked because I would never show them to anybody. But I'm trying to find, I look like such a little baby with, I didn't know how to make a thumbnail. So it's just like a random screenshot. I'm trying to, like, they're so horrible. They were awful. Joanna, I wore my stethoscope. Like, there's nothing worse than a first year medical student. And I say that with love to anybody who may be here in the first year of medical school, but you feel so important and you know nothing because you're just at the beginning. I'm trying to find it. So here's a video from 10 years ago that's called Science Fiction is for Everybody that I recorded with pigtails in my hair.
I
And
can see this episode.
around my neck. Talking about an article that I read that said I think it was entitled something like, I don't know, 5 sci-fi books for girls. And I took personal affront to that because I was like, all science fiction's for girls, thank you. And I was a lot more fiery when I was in that particular phase of my life. So I recorded this like very ranty video with these big deals. I've gone back to watch it. It's really funny, but that was my introduction to BookTube 10 years ago. So then I took a long pause for the better.
Why did you decide not to continue or post it?
I think I just got busy. Like I thought, I'm going to do this and it's going to be a fun hobby. And then actual, like the amount of work that I started having to do grew and I just didn't
Yeah.
stick with it. So,
So have you been a consistent fantasy reader all these years, even when you were going through medical school?
mostly I didn't read as much fantasy. I keep a record of everything that I've read, and I've done that for a really long time. But I have been a consistent fantasy reader. Like I said, I mostly reread the same things when I was in high school, and then when I was in university, I still consistently read, but it was not as much fantasy. It was more contemporary literary classics because I was reading so much for my degree that I needed to do that. I was reading some things in English and some things in French. So it
Yeah.
was a lot. And then when I went into med school, because my time was more limited, I did read more YA because it's not something that I had ever read before. And it is very accessible and it's like really easy to make your way through. The books read very quickly. And so that's mostly what I did because it didn't take as much time.
Yeah. That's great though. I mean, I feel like you probably have been a lot more consistent than I have, but that's impressive by the way that you can read in French too. So are you fluent in French as well?
I would have said so 10 years ago when I graduated from university, but it's hard when you don't use it. So I had told a couple people on Discord that if I hit 5K subscribers, I would record a video in French and put it up. So I will still try to do that. It's difficult, and I think because I studied French instead of learning it through immersion, there was such a focus on grammar that now when I speak French, or especially if I listen to myself speak French, I know that I'm making errors and I'm frustrated about it, but in the moment I hadn't caught them, and so it makes me feel like I've lost something when I go back and rewatch it. So that's going to have to be something that I overcome if I'm going to post something. But at the time, I would have said yes, that I was fluent. I did live in France for a little while. I worked over there, not exclusively in French because I worked at a Canadian site. It was a World War One historic site that they have over in France, and it's actually very Newfoundland centric. So they have two sites actually. So they have Vimy Ridge, which is closer to the town that I was living in, and then they have Beaumont Hamel, which is interesting because J.R.R. Tolkien was actually there at Beaumont Hamel, like in the trenches. So it's fun to think about. Well, not fun to think about, but it's interesting to think about. He was there, and it's a very somber place. It's obviously a place where you do a lot of reflecting, but it was an honor to be able to go over there. They choose 15 Canadians to go over in batches, and you do it in kind of like semester. So you can take the semester off university, or you can go in between university semesters. So I went from April to September and spent time over there. So basically what you do is you give tours at the historic site and you talk about the war and how it affected people. And they do like to try to hire Newfoundlanders to work at the Newfoundland site because that's part of our history. But it was really fun. It was a very valuable experience for sure.
That's cool. That's
Yeah.
very cool. Nice.
But I couldn't do that now. So I don't think I could get up. Like back then I would go and just get up and give the tour around the site and, talk to people and answer all their questions. And now I feel very nervous that I'm either not going to understand or I'm going to miss a word and I would never put that on anyone else. I admire people who get on and do booktube with English as their second language. And I think that they're all amazing, but I'm much harsher with myself.
I'm impressed with how many channels out there of people who speak multiple languages. It just kind of blows my mind. I've like always believed I have some kind of block with learning other languages because I grew up in a bilingual household. My family speaks Spanish fluidly. Spanish was my parents' first language, and for some reason, I just my husband with the thick Southern accent, he knows more Spanish than I do, and it's really embarrassing. So
that's interesting. And did they speak Spanish with you when you were a child?
No, I think that's the problem. I'm pretty convinced that if they had taught me Spanish as my first language, that I would have picked more of it up. I was the youngest of 4 kids, and I think with my oldest, I want to say with my 2 brothers and sister, it was their first language, or they spoke it much more heavily to them than English at the time. But by the time I was born, I think they were just too Americanized. So they taught me English first, and I really feel like I would have been forced to have to learn English regardless because of school. But yeah, I don't know. They speak it around me all the time. I just have no idea what they're saying. And then they have to tell me. It's
That's
really bad, Sarah.
it's
It's
good for
really
them as
bad.
parents because they can talk about whatever they need
Oh,
to
yeah.
in their special
I think they've
language.
done it before, and I could tell by the tone, but
Yeah.
it's
Actual strategy employed by parents.
yeah. Yeah, I don't know. And it's weird too how things change over time because even though I grew up with the language, I grew up with it in my ear all the time. For a
Mhm.
long time, even though I didn't know Spanish, I at least felt like I had bragging rights that I could pronounce it very well. And
Mhm.
like I could sing songs in Spanish or I could, read Spanish and speak it with the perfect accent. Now that's not even true. Um, I don't know if it's living in the South for too long, but now I'll try to read a line in Spanish, and my mom said, "Yeah, you have the accents all wrong." And I'm like, "Oh, dang it."
Oh, no.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty embarrassing, but it's interesting though, because I mean, like my dad, he didn't know English until he moved here for college, like not until he was, I guess 17, and he learned English super fast. He learned
That's
it super,
amazing.
super fast. And my mom, she didn't know English until she started school, until she started kindergarten. And
Mhm.
her teacher, unfortunately, was pretty racist and pretty hard on her for not knowing English. But she learned English so fast and she learned how to read in English super fast. And she already knew how to read in Spanish. So they were both very skilled with that. I don't know why. I just like have some kind of weird block.
That's
It's pretty
very
sad.
impressive.
But I'm envious of anybody who could speak multiple languages. So Alan is going to become a YA channel. Yeah.
I can see it. I can see it.
Yeah. I told Alan, I think like the one YA book that I DNF'd a while back was Fireborn. And it's like the one he loves, but that was before he read it. So I need to give that one another shot. Have you read that one? Or
I
that
have
series?
only the first one, only the
Oh,
first.
what did you think of it?
I liked it, but I didn't love it, and I think it's just because the things that appealed to Alan are not my personal areas of interest. So I can understand that if you are interested in that topic, that it would be a great read to you. And I still liked it. I think I probably gave it like 4 stars or something. I didn't dislike it. But some of the tropes that I like less in YA were present in Fireborn. And I did not like the way that they were handled in Fireborn. Like it was just not appealing to me in that way. And I think one of the things that has pulled me away from YA in general is not so much the tropes and some of the content, but it's just the fact that now that I am older, I think of people who are 15 or 16 as so young. You're
Yeah.
so little. You're such a little tiny child. And how are you doing these things? And why are people expecting you to do them? Where's your mom? Like go get your mom and get her to help you with these things. So that's more of the perspective like that is what I find hard sometimes. And so if I do read YA now, sometimes I will read like a really hard-hitting contemporary YA because I think that those stories are still universal and it talks about some of the things that teenagers, adolescents are struggling with. But for some of the fantasy ones, I'm like, why are you at 16 the person that we are depending on? That I feel sad for them. Someone needs to help you and hug you and give you a cupcake. So
That's hilarious. That is so funny. Oh my goodness. And Alan is talking about making a YA and beauty products channel, and we're here
I
for
will
it.
watch that, Alan, because I don't know how to use any beauty products, which is why no matter what the lighting is like, my skin looks exactly the same. So I need
Um,
that advice. Please teach me how to curl my hair.
and DIY home improvement projects. I
Excellent.
used to
Very
love
good.
HGTV. I used to have an addiction to that show. I don't know why. So I'd watch Alan do that. That'd be fun. I think everybody is encouraging that path for you, Alan. Um,
Absolutely.
I'm actually listening to an audiobook right now that I picked up based on Leslie's recommendation, The Nerdy Narrative.
Mhm.
It's called The Violin Conspiracy.
Mhm.
And it's interesting because now that you're talking about YA, because when I started listening to it, I didn't think it was a YA book at all. I thought, especially because the narrator sounds like a man, he doesn't
Mhm.
sound like a 16-year-old, but I think it is actually following a 16-year-old, is what I've gathered. And I am loving it so far. It's not the genre I typically pick up at all. It's
Mhm.
a mystery type of story, and I've heard it described as mystery meets literary fiction. It's because it deals with racism, especially
Mhm.
being a musician, especially being a violinist of color, being a Black violinist specifically. and just some of the issues with that are in our society, but also this mystery underneath everything. But my goodness, I am so into it. I'm almost a quarter through it just because I haven't been able to stop listening to it the last couple of nights. And I listen to a lot of audiobooks to help me fall asleep. Like if I'm having insomnia, I turn on an audiobook and then I turn on the sleep timer. And usually I'm out before the sleep timer is out on my audiobooks. But this one, I had insomnia last night. I woke up at like 3:30 in the morning, or I don't know. I woke up at some awful hour and I couldn't fall back asleep. And I listened to 20 minutes and I was just like, what? I need to know more. And then I didn't want to go back to sleep.
I miscalculated. This was a bad plan.
Yeah, but I think part of it too is just because I know, of course, a lot about music culture. So a lot of the things that he's talking about the music and about classical pieces and about Stradivarius instruments, just totally have me hooked. But it's pretty cool so far.
That is awesome.
Yeah. I've lost track of what's happening here. Yay. I'm just skipping ahead here. Joanna, what? Really? Oh, that's right. That's right. Oh, I think that I knew that about you, Michael. Wow. So I guess that goes for your kids too, Michael? Because I think yeah, I'm pretty much alone in that. I really wish I knew more Spanish because I do have a lot of family that lives in Mexico as well. And it's always been hard not being able to communicate with them, unfortunately. Oh, and thank you so much, Michael, for the super sticker. It's so nice of you. Yeah. Anyway, so oh, I have a question for you. What about audiobooks? Did you because you listen to audiobooks too, right? Did you read or listen to audiobooks prior to having a channel? Was that something you've been into for a long time?
Very rarely. So I can remember a few of the audiobooks that I had listened to, and they were mostly just from the library. So I listened to, there's a series, I think it's called the Curse Worker series by Holly Black, that turned me from audiobooks for a long time because it was a YA fantasy series and I just did not like the audio. And so I thought, well, audiobooks are not for me. Absolutely 100%. And so I moved away from that one time that I listened to an audiobook. I didn't like it. So I thought that I would move over to nonfiction. So before having a channel, I did listen to some audiobooks from the library, but they were nonfiction. So I didn't do any fiction on audio before starting a channel. And then that was one of the most helpful type of videos when I first started watching BookTube, was watching people's audiobook recommendations videos. And I started to feel a little more comfortable branching out and trying some more books on audio, and ended up really liking them and just realizing that it depends a lot on the narrator and if I like what they're doing. And sometimes I still find one that I really don't like there was a YA book actually that Elliot Brooks read a couple of years ago and really liked, called The Kingdom of Back. That was about Mozart and Mozart's sister. I think it's Mozart. And I started the audiobook for that and I did not like it at all. So I was like, nope, this is going to be, I'm much more liberal about DNFing audiobooks than I am regular books. Because if I don't connect with the narrator right away, then I will not do it. And I would never ever buy an audiobook without doing the sample.
Yeah.
It would never happen.
Very smart. I have DNF'd so many audiobooks, it's not even funny. But with that particular book, I actually did listen to that one too, The Kingdom of Back. And I totally understand what you mean. I look back at that one and I often think I might have liked that more if I had read it physically. Because something about the way that narrator did kid voices was grating.
Good voices. And it was Mozart from Austria, the Austrian accent that they would put in sometimes, as this is not good. I don't like this.
It made Wolfgang Mozart sound so irritating. Oh, yeah. I didn't really care for that one as much either. It was a good story, but I think the narrator did bring it down for me as well. I felt that way too with Daughter of the Moon Goddess. I felt like the narrator, I think part of my issue was the narrator with that one. But yeah, I just wanted to ask though, because I've just noticed a trend, and I know this was the case with me, that I got more into audiobooks as a result. I feel like BookTube has gotten more people into audiobooks than anything else. Because everyone I talked to who started getting into audiobooks, they started because of BookTube culture.
Yeah, absolutely. I was influenced.
Yeah. But actually, when I thought back on it, the first audiobook, and I often forget about this, I always forget about this, but the first audiobook or one of the first audiobooks that the first audiobook I ever listened to from beginning to end was a nonfiction as well. It was This Is Your Brain on Music. And it was
Mhm.
for my music psychology class because I had to read it over the summer and I didn't feel like physically reading it. So I listened to it. So that was kind of my cheat with that. But yeah, I actually got into it mostly because I was very skeptical and I didn't even know that about audiobook apps at the time. And
Mhm.
so I went and checked out CDs from the library and I checked out Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman and I would listen to
Mhm.
it in my car and I loved it so much. That one is narrated by Neil Gaiman.
It's an excellent audiobook. I've
I
listened to
was
that too.
oh, it's so good. It just I wanted to drive everywhere. I was like, "I need to go drive just so I can listen to this some more." And then I later realized, oh, you can download apps and you can listen to it on slightly faster speeds because it took me
I don't
10
have to drive everywhere.
for 10 hours a day or whatever. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
So I
that's
just think
awesome.
it's interesting how a lot of people have gotten into audiobooks because of BookTube. I know we have a couple of people who I don't like giving so much control away to an audiobook. Yeah. I mean, it
That's
really
fair.
does depend. I'm having that problem with my current audiobook. Yeah.
That's he talking about the blade itself again.
Stephen Pacey? How can you not love Stephen Pacey, Alan? That's crazy. Wow.
I feel like this is just Alan being purposely inflammatory again.
I know. I know. Let's see. I want to read more. I don't know who this author is.
Diana Wynne Jones.
Wynne
She
Jones?
wrote Howl's Moving Castle.
Oh, okay. I've heard of the book, but I've never read it. Yeah. I did go through a phase where I read a lot of Patricia McKillip books,
Mhm.
but I don't remember a single one. Like, I don't remember any of them. And I read one after another one year. I just went to the library and I just kept checking them out, but I don't remember them. I remember I enjoyed my time with them, but that's
But
about
don't
it.
remember a lot about what they were about.
I don't remember anything about what they were about. Yeah. Hello there. What's literary fiction? I think that that's just kind of a genre term that people throw out there to describe anything that's not, well, I don't know. People say that there's genre fiction and there's literary fiction, and I guess genre fiction would speak to more speculative fiction, I'm assuming. I don't know. Do you have a good answer for that, Sarah?
I don't know if I have a good answer because I feel like that's a question that could take up an entire video, and it's something that's very personal. Like, for example, there are definitely booktubers that classify things as literary fiction that I don't. Like, for example, Murphy Napier will call Frederick Bachman literary fiction, which I would not. I would just say that he is a contemporary author. And I don't associate that with literary fiction because to me it feels more like entertainment than
Mm.
how I typically view literary fiction. This is where it becomes really subjective. So for me, when
Yeah.
I classify something as literary fiction, it is something that is thematically driven or thematically focused as opposed to purely character driven, although lots of them are very character driven or plot driven, obviously. So something to me that is more plot driven is not literary fiction, which I know is like that's a totally subjective thing. It is just how I distinguish them in my head. And sometimes it can even trip me up because, and I wish I had my writing journal here, but I don't, or my reading journal, because I do like a tick for each of the different kinds of genres that I read throughout the year. And I always check up on them. So like at the end of the month, I'll count everything and make sure it lines up and think like, have I forgotten a book? And inevitably there comes a month where you have forgotten something. So then I'm re-going over all of the books and being like, okay, there's this many fantasy ticks, this many science fiction ticks. And then I'll get to like contemporary, classic, literary, modern classic. And I'm like, oh God, like what did I classify as what? Because there is no firm demarcation between those genres. It's just, for me, that's what I would call literary fiction. So literary fiction to me would be, what's some recent literary fiction that I read? Like A Ghost in the Throat was a book that I read last year by an Irish author, and it was about her experience of motherhood. And she was analyzing motherhood through her love of this epic Irish poem. And the poem was about a woman who had been overlooked by history and only remembered for being the mother of someone famous and the wife of someone famous. So it was about her identity as a mom and how sometimes that can subsume who you are as a person. So it was very like the focus of that book was an exploration of that topic. And there were other elements, but that's what the book was focused on. So that to me is what literary fiction is. Whereas in Bachman, like for example, Beartown, I think the plot is very much the focus, and Bachman does like to explore ideas. And I think that he definitely has an agenda, like not in a negative, like, way, but he has a goal when he sets out to write a book, and he wants to explore ideas around that goal, but the plot is very much front and center. And I think for me, and this is gonna like, this opens up a whole other conversation, is there's also, I think, a level of writing that makes me classify something as literary fiction, but people would say that you can't say writing is good or bad, which I don't know if I totally agree with that premise, but it's not something that I'll argue about on BookTube. But there is a standard, an internal standard created by me for books that I read, that I will, that's how I will analyze the writing. And if it meets this internal standard that I have, then I will look at it as literary fiction. So it's a hard question. It's interesting though.
No, I think that a lot of people do that though, because I think even like I've heard Murphy Napier talk about how great Richard Bachman's prose is. Yeah, sorry, Bachman's prose is, and so like in her mind, and I don't know if I listened to an audiobook of Anxious People. That's about as much exposure as I've had to that author. So I don't really know that I could assess it, but I know some people do consider his prose really exceptional for whatever reason, and maybe that's why. But I wouldn't have necessarily, at least based on just that one experience. Yeah, I don't know. It is really tricky. I don't know how I would
Al's answer at the bottom is it has to be pretentious to be literary fiction.
I was waiting for that. Yeah. I just don't know. I loved your book, by the way, and I know I'm giving you like all these like video ideas, but I'll go ahead and speak. I'll speak to one video I did love of yours a long while back about prose and what you felt made good prose, and the different types of prose from different authors that you enjoyed. That was such a great video.
Yes, I really like doing those videos. So I did a couple. I did one on characters, one on prose. I do have one planned out that I want to do for dialogue, and there's someone who's going to help me narrate it someday. Maybe if he ever becomes my friend again, maybe he'll help me with that video.
That would be fantastic. Yay.
But I would like to do more of that, like about dialogue was one that I had picked out. I think humor was one that I had done or I had planned out. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm doing some research right now. So my next project that I want to do, which I'm hoping I'm going to be able to do in the next couple of weeks, is to put out an essential reading guide for foundational fantasy, classic fantasy, and modern fantasy. And on those lists to try to reach outside like the typical what I would have on a top 10 or like my favorite books, and more if you were someone who was coming into fantasy after a long time and you wanted to see like what is representative of the genre as a whole, if you wanted to have a good handle on what modern fantasy looks like these would be the books to read, or that for classic fantasy or for foundational fantasy, because we all have our eras that we read in. And I had already done a lot of that reading when I put together my favorite fantasy per decade videos that I did. So I ended up reading a lot about it at that time. And I think that would be interesting.
That's a really cool idea. Something I had an idea of wanting to do as a long-term project, and I don't know that I will ever get there because this is hard. I don't know if I could do it, is I was wanting to come up with a list, and this is based on a couple of booktubers I interacted with last year, especially, who were asking me for fantasy recommendations, but they were people who were not sure about fantasy, and they read a lot of what would be considered by a larger audience, I guess, literary fiction. And they wanted to, and they didn't want to read a series. So it's like, I was trying to think of standalone books for people who are new to fantasy. But the challenge with that is I feel like every video I've seen, so maybe Sarah, you could be the one to do this, but I feel like every single video I've seen where people talk about, here's what to read if you're new to fantasy, they're usually books that transition from YA fantasy to adult fantasy. But these are people who are well-read. These are people who are, that's not going to work for them. I don't think that they're going to necessarily click
Enjoy
with
that.
Anderson or, the
No.
fun, flimsy, whimsy fantasy or whatever. I said flimsy, but I meant whimsy.
That's okay. That's okay. Both work.
Yeah.
I did a video that's kind of a little bit like that. I did if you're new to fantasy, coming from different genres, like which books to start with. So like if you like literary fiction, read this fantasy book. If you liked romance, read this fantasy book. If you liked thrillers, read this fantasy book. But it was only one book per genre that you were coming in from. But I think that would be an interesting video idea. That would be cool.
Yeah, yeah, it would be cool, especially, like, with standalones too, 'cause but,
Mhm.
yeah, it's always kind of, like, a challenging thing to think about, but I only have, like, a few that come to mind right now, so I need to read more standalones for sure, which is always a hard thing. I feel like and I mean, this is my own prejudice, this is my own bias right now. My thoughts are always evolving on this topic, of course, but that's one of my own areas of, where I have some biases that with YA is because or towards adult over YA, I should say, because I found that when I read a lot of YA, every
Mhm.
single time I would read YA, I would think, this could have ended with one book. I just always would hate the sequels. I would hate
Yeah.
it. I would always feel like it was dragging out a story that didn't need to be dragged out. And I always feel the opposite when I'm reading fantasy, usually because it's more epic in scope somehow. I don't know.
Mhm.
But with fantasy, I always feel like you almost can't wrap it up. Some people can. I mean, there are obviously some amazing adult fantasy standalones out there, and I
Mhm.
haven't read Tigana yet, for example. Speaking of one of the more famous ones, but a lot of epic fantasy, I think it does well when you have a series or a trilogy, or
Absolutely.
you do draw it out. And with YA fantasy, I mean, I feel like it's almost like a publisher push to stretch it out.
Yes, agreed. So I think that is true.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not really sure why that's the case, if that's just, the world or writing being less complex. I haven't really pinpointed what it is yet, but that's just been my experience so far. See what's happening here in the chat. Uh, and currently listening to Nettle and Bone. Did you ever get to that one? I know you were talking about it, I think, at
I
one
still
point.
haven't. I still would like to. I do really want to read it, and it's short, so I'm hoping I will find a place to shuffle it in sometime soon.
Yeah. I listened to the audiobook of it at the end of last year
Mhm.
and had some mixed feelings about it, so I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on it.
Mhm.
Yeah. But it could have been I think some of it could have been a mood thing for me too.
Get Penny. She was doing audiobooks. She's an audiobook hipster.
That's awesome, Penny. Yeah. I mean, they've been around for a while. It feels like they've become more and more prominent lately. Homer and the Marn, everyone has a flag on their face, and Homer is just Homer. Yeah, that's me when everyone starts talking. Yeah, I know not everyone is into audiobooks. I go through phases too. I'm definitely an audiobook mood reader. So right now, this month, I finally got a mood back to listen to audio again.
Mhm.
I was not in audiobook headspace for the last quarter of last year. I just couldn't get into any audiobooks at all and preferred to read physically.
I also can't do other things while I listen to audiobooks. So I know some people, like Andrew, for example, is really good at this. Like he says he listens to audiobooks at work, like when he's multitasking. If I'm listening to an audiobook, it needs to only be the audiobook. So I actually get through audiobooks at a much slower pace than regular books because I don't like to speed them up. I like where I am at 1.3, and I know Kyle has a method and blah, blah, blah that you can do to speed them up. And it sounds fine, but I don't want it. I like the way that it sounds at 1.3. And I also need to concentrate. I can't even do a puzzle. So you'll see lots of people saying like, oh, I'll do a puzzle and listen to my audiobook. I'm like, how? I know that I'm particularly bad at puzzles, as evidenced by my book cover video. I'm not a very visual person, so puzzles are actually really hard for me. But I can't listen to an audiobook and do it at the same time. And I don't want to be like having to rewind. So the only time I listen to audiobooks is if I'm just like vegging. I'm just there, just like flopped out, just having a, relaxing time. Or if I am doing house chores
Yes.
because I don't need to concentrate on anything to do that. I'm just either like doing dishes or packing up laundry or, anything.
I know I'm in an audiobook mood or I'm really into an audiobook if I start cleaning like crazy.
Right, if your house is very
All the
clean,
things.
it means that you found a good audiobook.
I know it, yeah, and I even have memories, like, I remember listening to the Warlord Chronicle book, to some of them, and I just couldn't stop cleaning. I just wanted to keep cleaning and cleaning. That's the only thing I can do, though. I can't even make, a YouTube thumbnail and listen to an audiobook at the same time, like, it's a real struggle. So,
Yeah.
and I used to be able to listen to them driving.
Mhm.
That was how I primarily listened to audiobooks back in the day, and now I really can't do it anymore. I find I keep on like, my mind keeps wandering when I drive, and I have to go
Yeah.
back and re-listen to things.
I can
So,
listen to them if I am a passenger. Like if Andrew is driving, then sometimes he'll put on music that he likes and I'll listen to an audiobook if we're not chatting. And usually it takes a long time to drive anywhere. So like we'll talk for an hour and then do our own thing for a little while. But if I am the person who is driving, I usually can't listen to them because I don't want to be distracted.
yeah. Yeah, it's a scary thing to be distracted while driving because of an audiobook, but you don't want that, especially if you're driving children.
Exactly.
So, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Yeah, a nonfiction does work really well for me too with audio,
Mhm.
that can help a lot too. But yeah, I am very sensitive to voices. And so some people I know they don't really care, but for me it does make a big difference if I don't
Mhm.
like the voice at all.
I've never listened to a thriller on audio, but I imagine that would be exciting. Like the tension.
Yeah.
I'm not very good at scary things, so I just watched the second episode of The Last of Us with Andrew last night, and I
Mm.
wish I could show you how it was. So like I was on the couch with him and like my legs were all the way and I had the blanket like here, and if he was like I was so jammed into him and like my talons were like in his arm the whole time that I was watching because I was so on edge watching it. And I can't imagine listening to something that would scare me on audio. I'd be a wreck.
Yeah. How do you like that
The
show?
show?
Mhm.
It's been really good. I really liked it. So it's only been two episodes. I'm not good with scary things, so I
Mm.
have been scared.
Yeah.
But I like the story and I think the actors are doing a really good job. So it's been fun. My dad was at my sister's house because it was her birthday and my nephew's birthday last week. So he missed the first two episodes. So I think he might watch those two this week and catch up and then come over and we'll watch it together.
Cool. Maybe I'll check it out. I played the video game a little while with my husband. He played most
Mhm.
of it, but I did
Yep.
play with him a little bit because there are some really cool story features to that game, and it's beautiful. It's just, I mean, graphics wise, it's a pretty dreary story, but
Yes.
I got really bored with the gameplay. I know that's an unpopular opinion. Sorry, everybody who loves that game, but I got so bored with it. It just wasn't my thing. Uh, so I wasn't sure, but I have been hearing great things about the show. So maybe I'll give
Nice.
it a
I
chance
only
sometime.
watch Andrew play them. The only video games that I can play are side scroll or Pokemon. So
Oh, yeah.
I don't have a lot of experience with playing games, but I do like to watch them if they have a cool story. So like I watched Andrew play God of War, I watched him play The Last of Us, and I liked the story. So I was excited to watch the show.
Yeah. I'm a weirdo though. I don't really, with very few exceptions, I rarely ever play video games because of the story. A lot of times I'm like, I don't care about the story. I just want the gameplay. So I'm kind of a weirdo that way because I love fantasy. I love stories, obviously. I wouldn't be here otherwise, but I don't really care about stories when I play games at all. And
Mhm.
then I I just recently DNF'd D&D for the first time. I've never played D&D until like this last year. And I got so bored. I was like, this is just not my thing.
Mhm.
Which is so weird because I feel like that's I mean, you have to love D&D if you're a fantasy lover, right? That's
And
crazy.
I do think in D&D's defense, the person who is the dungeon master can make a big difference. So the
Mhm.
story that you're in, the person who's hosting, all those things make a big difference. I found I have struggled sometimes with D&D depending on what we're doing, how many people it is, how role heavy the game is. I play Call of Cthulhu with a group of friends as
Oh,
well
fun.
and really enjoyed that because it was less combat focus, more uncovering the mystery than D&D was, and I found that to be really fun.
Is that like a Lovecraft
Yeah.
inspired thing? Okay, cool. And maybe if, Posh Allen was the DM, maybe that'd be really fun. Yeah. Oh man, I really got some fires lit about the about literary fiction. That is funny. Oh, how funny.
I was saying
Um,
McCarthy's literary fiction.
oh, I'm having a love affair with McCarthy right now. He's the best. He's the best. Um, oh, I was gonna ask you too. I play games sometimes. So I'm boring and I just like the gameplay kind of part. And really nerdy, embarrassing fact about me, I was a LARPer when I was a teenager. So I was a
I
live
would love
action
that.
role player.
Mhm.
And even then I didn't really care about the story part of character building and all of that. And some people would kind of get lost in their characters in this world or whatever. I just wanted to go up and hit people with my phone sword. That's all I cared about.
This is your aggression coming out. This is what's happening.
I know, it's crazy, but it was so fun. And I was small, so I could always hide behind a shield and wrap around with my sword and like run around. And I don't know, it was just super fun. So I love doing that, but yeah, I'm a weirdo. I'm a weirdo. And I feel sad about it because I just feel like everybody loves D&D, everybody. And I know Big Bookborn talked about it in a recent video.
Mhm.
And she also talked about a video game that I want to pick up too, which was really cool.
That is a video game I could play because that did look like a side scroll video game.
It
I was
looks
like, I
fun.
could play this. This looks fun. This looks like something that I could handle. So I was also thinking after I watched Bookborn's video that I would get it. And I actually asked Andrew if he had played it before, and he said that he had heard of it but had not played it. So maybe we'll both do it.
There was a game like that. They even looked very pixelated and everything. And I cannot remember the name of it for the life of me. And I
Mhm.
was so addicted to it and it was so good. And actually the story was really good, even though
Mhm.
I just said I don't really care about stories when I play games. But the story to that one was incredible. And I think it was neat too, because it actually had some really good mental health representation and it had a beautiful response to mental health. And I loved it. It was just beautiful. Um, and it was just super fun and it had really cool, exciting kind of 80s vibe music. So I
Nice.
loved it. It was super fun. But I do have other hobbies. I used to, yes, I know. And actually, Philip, I wasn't an elf, I was a gnome.
That is odd. I didn't think that story could get any better, but now it is.
And the reason I wanted to be a gnome is because I like little gnomes, not necessarily David the gnome, but I had this like idea of gnomes being these little people with big noses. And I thought they were cool. Like I was like, I kind of have a big nose and I'm small. And I thought, poor gnomes, nobody wants to be a gnome. So
Aw.
I thought I would take that up. But I'm really honored to be considered an elf on BookTube until I read Philip's book, and then I'll probably be very offended that he considers me an elf because I've heard about how they're described in his book. Yeah, I know. I need to. Maybe someday I'll love it. I really want to love D&D someday. I really what? No.
No. Also, Philip's
I,
pun.
I did know that about Alan. I actually did know that about Alan, that Alan hates gnomes. I
Oh,
probably shouldn't have said anything. Not David the gnome. I don't like David the gnome. He doesn't have a big enough nose. Yeah, yeah, they are very sneaky.
mhm, mhm.
Yeah, we're all very excited about Philip's books, but I did hear him talk with the brothers Gwyn about how evil and cruel and ugly elves are in his series.
Oh,
So
does
we'll
that feel like a
see.
personal attack?
It did after because before he was like, "Oh, Juana, you would be an elf," and I was like, "Oh, what an honor!" And I was thinking like Tolkien elves, and then I found out about elves in his story. I'm like, oh. Now it's a personal attack.
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm.
Um, what was I going to say? Oh, yeah. So I'm curious because I love your review style. I love reviews, and I know that those are things that people say are underappreciated on BookTube or don't get a lot of views. Do you enjoy doing reviews personally?
I do. I do. If I love a book, I will review it. If I think I have something unique to say. I have not done a lot of Abercrombie reviews, for example. I really wanted to for Red Country because I unexpectedly loved it so much. Not that I didn't expect to like it, but I didn't expect it to be my favorite. So when I read it, I was like, I need to review this immediately. And if I do love something, then I'll review it. If it's new, I find the review is probably going to be more valuable for people because everybody has reviewed the Stormlight Archive. Everybody has reviewed, there are some things that I don't think that I have a lot to offer above and beyond what is already there. But newer books, I do get excited to review. Like I said, I just read The Daughters of Izdihar and did a review for that. My next, so I was talking about one of the projects that I was working on, but one of my other projects that I am trying to put together now is a series of short reviews to go back and like review many of the books that I have read and just kind of like put them out like a couple of times a week outside of my regular recording schedule, and to put them all in the same format so that if you're thinking of reading a fantasy book, you can just, you know, go and see if it is there in the list. And it will obviously be much less in depth than a full regular review, which I still hope to do, but might be helpful in just deciding like, do I want to read this? What is it like? You know, what does it compare to? Those kinds of things, because sometimes it would be nice to have that for certain books just to judge whether or not it is for you. We all have these giant like 1,000 book long TBRs that we need to try to organize in some way. So I think that would be helpful, but I do really like doing reviews. How many people watch them doesn't really factor into whether or not I'm going to record it. It's more, do I think that I have something to say? Did I love it enough to want to talk about it? And sometimes I want to talk about a series. So I didn't review any of the death books individually, but I do want to do a series review for them. It was the same thing for Warlord Chronicles. Sometimes I just want to wait until I get to the end and then talk about it all together so that I can talk about my journey or my progression through the series.
I like that too. I like to do the book one review and then do or even just do a full series review is kind of fun.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's pretty cool. How do you go about your reviews? Do you, are you somebody who just goes for it right after you finish? I'm just going to talk right after I finish. Or I saw that you also have a reading journal, which is
Mhm.
something I love to do as well. Do you write your thoughts out first, or how do you go about that?
I do write in my reading journal, but it's usually like 3 or 4 sentences just to remember, like, why did I read this? Because I had said earlier, I have recorded the books that I read since 2010. So in 2010, I started writing down every book that I read and just the date that I read it. And in 2020, in my personal journal, I did this reflection back on like the last decade of reading and like what were my favorite books I read in the last 10 years? What stood out? What did I like? How did the genres change? And it was really fun to look at that over time and see what happened. But then there were some books that were on that list. I couldn't remember why I picked them up. I couldn't remember, like, did someone recommend that to me? Was it something I saw in the library? Did I just buy it? Some of them I could remember very clearly, but for others, especially during the years that my kids were babies and I was clearly like sleep deprived all the time and really didn't know what was happening, I couldn't remember how I picked them up. I remembered the books, but not how they came to me. And so I started the reading journal mostly so that I could put in some of those details. So like in my reading journal, I will say, Alan loved this book and reviewed it, so I picked it up. Or Joanna talked about this on her channel, and so I picked it up. And it gives me some context for why I was reading the things that I was reading. Because sometimes it was really easy to tell. Like I will look at a year, I'm like, oh, that's the year that Isaac was born. And I was clearly like very tired and I wanted to read things like this. And that's why that happened. But it would be nice to have some of that context. So that is why I mostly started to read or do the reading journal. For reviews, it's variable. So if I have time, because my ability to record, just like my ability to come and be on live streams, is limited because I have regular work, then I do anywhere from like 3 to 6 days on call in like a 10-day block, depending on when it's my turn to be doing like lighter call or heavier call. And that means I'm on for 24 hours. Actually, here, because I'm in a rural hospital, I'm usually on for 3 days straight. So I'm on call for 3 days and I have to be available at all times. So I can't film during any of those times because I'm getting calls from the hospital all the time. And I record on my phone. So I need to have that with me. So sometimes if I have the time between like work, call, kids, other things, then I'll record it right away. And then I usually don't do notes because I use the same format for all the reviews. I talk about things in all the same way, and I've just finished the book. So I don't feel like I need to write down anything about it. If I know that it's going to be like a week or 4 or 5 days before I can talk about it, then sometimes I will do like some quick jot notes just to remind myself of certain points that I wanted to talk about or those types of things. So it depends. I prefer to do it when I finish because it feels more authentic. It feels like I'm still immersed in the book. I am still really excited about it. Not that I'm not 5 days later, but it's a little bit easier to just do it off the cuff then, but it's not always possible.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good format. I think like one of the questions here, and then I'm going to go back to something you were talking about too earlier, about what's a book review that you were nervous to put out or nervous about the response of any. I don't know. I think for me, what I've noticed is I feel like I would probably do better if I had more of the format of just speaking right after I read sometimes. I don't feel like I'm never confident doing that. Maybe because I just don't have the best verbal skills. I don't know. I feel like I have to sit and think about what I feel. Maybe I'm just not always sure right away. And so it takes a while for me to gather my thoughts. But I've noticed that the more emotional I am about a book, the more time I feel like I need, the more nervous I am about putting out a review. And then
Right.
the more I feel like I have to do it.
The
Over
more
my
you
nerves.
see out there.
Yeah. So, like, for example, I did the Stoner and Augustus review. I sat on those books forever before doing a video about it. And I
Mhm.
think, I don't know, it's just because I didn't want to be like, I just love this book. It's awesome, which is what I would be tempted to do probably. So, I wanted to have something meaningful to say and be able to explain why it was meaningful to me and maybe have something helpful for people who would be interested in the book. And me
Mhm.
just gushing about it is probably not very helpful. So, so I have to, I don't know, I guess that's why I get nervous about books that I love a lot. And it's also why I take my time to put out those reviews. But I do find it rewarding regardless. I find doing reviews, and I knew with that particular video, I knew that was not going to get very many views at all
Mhm.
because I'm more of a fantasy focused channel, and those are more quote unquote literary fiction, historical fiction. But I had to, sometimes when you love a book, there's something about you feel like you're honoring the book a lot by doing a review. I think that's how many of us feel anyway.
Absolutely. I don't know that there is a book review that I have been nervous to put out. I will say something that makes me nervous. People will sometimes ask me to read their books, or even people that I know or have interacted with on BookTube have books, and I'm nervous to read them because I feel like I would want to review them because I want my friends to do well and I want to spread the word about their books, but I'm also nervous about not liking them, and I don't feel like I could make a review about something that I didn't like and not say how I felt about it because I don't think it would come off as very genuine, and I don't think I'm not very good at masking how I feel. I'm not a great that is not a skill. I can be neutral in receiving information because some of the people that I have to talk to are very unwell, and the things that they say can be very shocking or intense. And so I have learned how to receive information with a very neutral face. I cannot always give my opinion with a very neutral face,
Yeah.
especially if it's a strong opinion. So I don't think that I would do well to do that. And so it makes me nervous about reading books from friends. And so that is something that does make me nervous. And I don't know. I am absolutely going to read Philip's book. I cannot imagine. But I also, no pressure to Philip, expect nothing but excellence. So it's like I don't really feel that nervous because
Yeah.
I've already placed that book at a certain level in my mind because I feel like I know Philip fairly well. I know what he's capable of. I've heard him speak. So I don't feel as nervous about that. But that is one thing that does make me a little bit nervous.
That is intimidating. It really is, especially with self-published authors, because your review is going to affect a lot of readership for them. And
Absolutely. And if I were ever to review something that's self-published, people talk about authenticity a lot on BookTube. And sometimes, and I don't think this comes from creators. I've never felt this way about a creator making a video, but I have sometimes felt this way about people commenting on certain videos, is that they will applaud negative reviews for honesty, and they kind of make it seem like your honest negative opinion is in some way more true than your honest positive opinion. And I
mm,
think it's because people want to be nice and you don't want to hurt people's feelings, and so there becomes this idea that something that is positive is not as authentic as something that is negative. And I just don't like making them. I sometimes find them entertaining. I absolutely think that there is a place for those kinds of reviews. And I think that we need creators who are making that kind of content because people want to know what they're going to like and what they're not going to like. But I don't think that being unabashedly positive about something is any less honest than being critical or negative of something. So I have read books that I didn't like as much, and I do try to frame them in a way that says, I didn't like this, but I think it would be really good for this person. I feel like Elliot Brooks is really good at this. Like, even if she doesn't like something, she frames it in a way that can tell you why you might like it instead. And I don't think that there's anything disingenuous about that. I think it's just trying to be positive toward the people who have put so much work into this. And again, this is not anything against someone who makes that kind of review, because I think that there is a place for that and it's important. And this is a reviewer space and a reader space, not an author space. But I just don't like it. It doesn't make me feel good. It makes me feel bad. So, and I don't, like I said earlier, I don't want to feel bad when I'm making videos. And I know that that would make me feel bad, even if I don't think that it's something that's automatically a bad thing. I think it can be a very good thing. But I also think that positivity is just as authentic as negativity.
I agree. Yeah, I 100% agree with all of that. And I mean, I think I told you about this before, possibly, but I know, like, with I mean, I think even if we're doing a gush review, I mean, I don't see why that's, yeah, I don't see, like, when people say something is overhyped. I think I know Jake Bishop shares my feelings about this a little bit. Like, I just don't really think things can be. I mean, I guess they can be overhyped in a way. Maybe, like, if publishers say this is the next Game of Thrones, or
Yeah.
I guess there's a way that things can be, in a way, sold in such a way where you're literally trying to sell something. But with most people, when they're enthusiastic about a book, I don't think that's overhyping. I think that could be a genuine response. Even if that fizzles a little over time or whatever. I mean, if that's somebody's genuine feeling about a book, I don't see why that should be considered overhyped. And I feel like sometimes just pure gushing or excitement is considered that.
Is considered overhyping.
Yeah.
I had an interesting conversation with Alan about this recently, about how sometimes people view enjoyment as a form of lesser thought than criticism. Like, you will
Oh,
be
yeah.
praised for
Mhm.
criticizing because they equate criticism with critical thinking, which is not the same thing. Like, they're not the same concept. They are related, but not identical. And you can be enthusiastic and you can be in love with something and you can really enjoy something for either the entertainment value or the joy that it brings you, and be no less a critical thinker than someone who has a very strict standard for books, and you are not getting anything from them above a 3 and a 3.5 rating. And, there are certain conventions that they need to follow, which again is a totally valid choice and a style of reviewing that works really well for people. But it doesn't mean that you are less capable of critical thought just because you're enthusiastic.
Absolutely. Actually, I heard a thing on NPR so many years ago where people were saying that, I guess these researchers were saying that people perceive in our culture or society that intelligence is associated with being critical.
Mhm.
And I took issue with that because, like, I think, for example, it's one thing to come up with criticisms of something. It's a whole other skill to be able to explain what could make something better. I feel like those are two separate things.
Yes.
Or, and so, like, for example, with music, if somebody says Celine Dion is a terrible singer, which, I mean, I would be surprised if people say that, but I'm sure people say that. Some people have said that. And if they're going to say that, like, oh, I hate Celine Dion's voice, it's just terrible. I'm like, okay, what is it about her voice? What is she doing specifically that you think is poor technique? What kind of techniques or approaches would help enhance that or improve that? To be able to explain that is a skill, like, it's building towards something. So I feel like that's a whole skill, even in talking about books. It's one thing to just say, this was awful, this just fell flat, this was boring, this was a slog. But to be able to explain, okay, so what would have made this more engaging for you?
Mhm.
What specifically didn't engage you and how could this be better? Or how, to be able to frame it that way. So I feel like that's, I mean, obviously I'm just talking about constructive criticism, but I don't feel like things are necessarily framed that way, even when people are being critical too. So
Yeah. No, absolutely.
yeah. And as far as what you were saying before too about wanting to know why you picked up a book or where you heard it from, it's neat because I did a column in a past bullet journal where I had a column of like where of a book that would come on my radar, and then another column of the first person I heard this from. I'd write down the book and then I'd say, found out about this from Alan from the Library of Alexandria, or
Mhm.
so I thought that that was cool because then I was able to go back and realize, okay, the first person I heard this from before it got, circulated around or whatever. So I thought that was pretty neat to trace that. And I think it also speaks to why read, why do you pick up the books you do? Because I think a lot of us don't really track that. And we don't
Mhm.
even, we're not even conscious of why we're picking up the books we are or where that's coming from.
And it's fun. In 10 years, you'll be happy that you wrote it down if you're like me.
Yeah, I'm like that. I mean, that's why I love journaling because I love to be able to look back at what I thought about certain things, or even to see books that I put that have come up on my radar or that I'm excited about. And that's something I wanted to start tracking this year. And let's see if I actually get around to doing it. I want to start tracking books that are coming on my radar that I'm excited or considering, and
Mhm.
then looking back later on and see, do I still feel that way? Or did it fall down for me over time, just to track that?
Yeah.
Because sometimes books, they come on my radar and then they stay there. They stay there like, I definitely still want to read this book a year later. And then
Mhm.
sometimes, and I did a video about this a long time ago about books I wanted to read the next year, and I didn't end up reading most of them. And, and I found a year later, I just wasn't interested in most of them anymore. So it's just interesting to see how those different influences play out over time.
Yes, and we all fall victim to the impulsive buy when we hear someone being
Oh,
enthusiastic about a book
100%.
or it circulates on BookTube. That's how we end up with these physical TBRs that are so large.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's just interesting the way that that can go up or down. Yeah, Andrew, let's see, Alan. Okay, uh, I don't watch reviews unless I read the book already. I used to be like that. Sometimes reviews spoil the book. Sometimes, I also don't read book descriptions. The best parts are often spoiled. Sometimes it's like that. I mean, like for example, the book I'm currently listening to, The Violin Conspiracy. I will not do a review on that book. I don't even know how I'm going to talk about that in a wrap up, honestly, because I
Mhm.
went into the book not knowing anything and it was purely a cover pull. I did hear Leslie talk about it, but I still felt like I didn't. I guess she did a good job because I didn't really feel like I knew what I was getting into. And within the first couple of, you know, uh, I guess minutes of the audiobook, I was already gripped by what happened right away. And I was so glad I didn't know when I went into it. So I don't want to spoil that for anybody. So so some books it's easier than others.
Absolutely.
And I guess that different people have different areas. Like if it's on the back of the book, I mean, sometimes that could be spoiled, but you know, if it's in the first paragraph or the first in the prologue, I think some reviews make an exception for that. I've made exceptions for that in my reviews.
Mhm.
Yeah. So let's see. That's so funny. I love how Alan gets so mad about overhype, but then he's so responsible for building up so much excitement about books like LPQ and Sunland Ascends and Guns of the
Mhm.
Dawn and Guards. I mean, I feel like he's the one who starts the circulation. But I guess it's not overhype if it's Alan. It's just he's the sparker of hype. That's not overhype. We'll just say that.
He is the hype.
He is the hype. Yeah. I think authenticity isn't positive or negative. It just is. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think that's also another reason for me personally why I kind of struggle too with like doing reviews right after I finish a book, because I often feel like I'm on this sort of high or wave of emotion. And not to say
Mhm.
that's not authentic, it is, but I also wonder if that's reliable after a while too, like,
Yes, and I think I'm personally very affected by a good ending. if I'm not enjoying something and the ending is really good, I will be way more likely to give it a higher rating than if I enjoy the beginning and it starts to flag off toward
Oh,
the
yeah.
end.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you finish? I can't and I'm sorry if this is like a because I know you wanted to finish Hero of Ages. Did you finally finish? You did finish that, right?
I
I know
did.
I
It was
saw
the
it in the
last
video.
book that I finished in December.
That's right. Yeah. Alright, have you I know you talked about it, and I can't remember what you said about it, except that you were going to get to it, and
I talked about it very briefly in a wrap-up video. I did not review it, but I think I reviewed the first and second books of Mistborn just because it had taken me so many years to read
Mhm,
them. I don't know if I'll review the third one or not. Maybe I should so that it's a complete set, but I liked The Hero of Ages. I think for me, it is the worst of the 3
mm,
Mistborn books.
mhm.
So I don't know if that is popular, unpopular, common, uncommon. I liked the ending, but I just think all together as a complete book, it is the weakest of the 3.
Ah, yeah. Yeah, I actually really loved that one the most, probably,
Mhm.
but the thing with the Mistborn that's interesting is just speaking of that excitement after the last book, I did have that after that book. I did have kind of a high experience, like, "Oh, wow, this was amazing," and then the
Yes,
next day, I thought, "Eh, it was alright." It just, like, came and went so
so
fast.
quickly.
Yeah, and I think part of it was that I wanted to love Mistborn so much because at
Mhm,
that point, that was a trilogy I picked up after taking a very long break from fantasy. And so I had read, like I said, A Song of Ice and Fire so many years ago. I took a
mhm,
very, very long break after some sci-fi I'd read after that. And then when I got back into fantasy, I wanted to have the experience I had with A Song of Ice and Fire. And I know I picked up like the Witcher series. I read all of those books and was
mhm,
kind of on a roller coaster with that. It was had some highs and lows. And then I picked up the Mistborn trilogy and I just wanted to have the thrill of my life. I wanted to love it so much because I saw so many people loving it and
mhm.
I enjoyed it. I thought it was okay. Um, but I think I knew even then I'm like it's not moving me like A Song of Ice and Fire did. It just didn't quite grip me that way. Um, and that frustrated me and it scared me because I thought I thought maybe I'll never feel this way again.
Oh, no. This is gonna be every book from now on.
I know. I don't think that's the case obviously now, but I mean I thought it was good, but like I said, it just came and went so fast, the
Mhm.
thrill I had towards the end.
No, I would agree that it did not stick with me for a long time.
Yeah. If you put a book on your want to read in Goodreads, you could then go into details of the book, yeah, and add personal notes. Yeah, I
See,
use that
I
too.
have never done that on Goodreads. That's a good idea.
That is a good idea. I've never done that either. I think criticism and praise should both be specific and involve critical thinking. Yes,
Yes.
absolutely. Hey, Jimmy. I feel the more I read, the more meh stuff I read, just because you see a lot of the same stuff. And once you get through the stuff you're really hyped about, you tend to take more risks on your TBR. I think that's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know. I think that's the thing. I mean, a lot of people talk about tropes in fantasy, for example. Um, I don't know. I don't mind tropes. I mean, I guess it depends on the trope or whatever. But you do want to see something different after a while. But then again, after a while, there's only so many ways a trope can be subverted. So it gets tricky sometimes.
And that's where it's nice to branch out in different genres sometimes.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I've thought that for so long now too, is I've never felt like reading other genres has detracted from my love of fantasy. It
Mhm.
always adds to it somehow, oddly. Maybe it just helps me to see it from a different angle or
I'm
something. A
happy
lot
to
of
get
people always
back.
say more. Yeah. But it's nice though when you see fantasy authors branch out. So like for example, you love the Dark Tower series
Mhm.
and Stephen King did an amazing job of meshing a whole bunch of different genres together.
Yes, I agree, and that became something that I loved from a very early age and was always seeking out in fantasy. So whenever books do that, I am predisposed to like them.
Yeah. Trying to go in as blind as possible. I think a lot of people do. I guess that's why a lot of reviews don't get watched initially, but
Mhm.
hopefully over time they do. And yay. Poor Philip. I guess that gets you views though, right? That's what I've heard from authors that one-star book that gets more attention somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Oh man. We're just the nicest group of friends here. We're just the most loving people.
I so expected it to be exceptional. It's, I don't have any doubts.
Yeah. Yeah, and we'll see
I
about
won't
that,
listen to the audiobook. That is guaranteed non-listen.
non-listen. It's going to be fun. Yeah. Narrator was amateur and sounds
Agreed.
I'm excited for it. I'm excited for it. Yay. Fantastic. It's looking. I'm going to scroll ahead over the chat.
I don't know, Alan. I'll tell you next week during the live show.
Are you two having a live show next week?
That is the plan, is to schedule one to talk about the books that Alan assigned to me.
So how many did you read?
There are 5 of them. I have not finished them all yet. So there's Ogres by Adrian Tchaikovsky, Senlin Ascends, Guards, The Folding Knife, and Sharp's Tiger.
I am like so eager to hear your thoughts on all of those books. So eager. But I guess I'll have to wait till next week. Yeah. I want to hear too. I want to hear like which books. Did you feel like you picked? Well, you're gonna probably have to answer this there, but I'm curious to hear which books you picked up. If you picked up all of them specifically because of Alan, if there were books you think you would have picked up anyway. I guess you'll have to save your thoughts, huh?
That's true. That's despite Alan's assertions to the contrary. He is the person who makes me most likely to pick something up. Like when he's excited about something, it's really hard not to want to read it.
Yeah. Yeah. I found that to be true ever since I've started following Alan. He's really good at that. He's really good at selling things. Something Alan does really well is, and I think I've tried to tell him this like 5 times and never finished the thought, but I feel like sorry, I think I have an echo. 1 second. I don't know what's happening. I'm gonna mute myself really quickly. Works. Try it again. Okay, I think my echo's gone, so we'll go with that. Yeah, something that I feel like Alan does really well in his reviews is he has a crescendo effect. So he starts off and he might start off really with a little bit of an excitement, and then he'll kind of bring it down, and then suddenly he'll start building up, and then the end is like this big crescendo, and then he kind of brings it down again. And on the King Star approval system, I give this, So I feel like there's almost like a musical format to Alan's reviews, which I really enjoy.
Absolutely. My greatest wish now, since I recorded the book cover video with Juliet, is to have Juliet record the book cover video with Alan, with the caveat, obviously, that he's not allowed to yell at her, because then I'll have to yell at him and it'll become a really like real booktube feud. But I think it would be really funny.
Yeah, that would be so funny. I'm the what? What's that? OxyClean? Yeah, man. That's funny. Oh, hello. That's really nice. And Jared has a channel there too. Yeah, that would be fun. I'm all for more of your videos with Juliet or any of your family members. I think those are super fun. I always enjoy watching people get together with their family members on videos or their significant others. Those are always fun videos to watch for me personally.
I do have a bookstore Lego set. And because, like I said, I'm not the best, like visual spatially, I'm not the best at building Lego. So my son has said that he will help me build it. So we may end up doing like a very short live stream where we just put together the bookstore Lego, and I'll ask him a couple questions about what he likes to read and stuff. But if he realizes he's being filmed, he might get a little bit nervous. But if I just put the camera over, not secretly, like he does want to do a video since his sister did, but if there's not that pressure of like having to look straight at the camera, I think he might do it a little bit better. I have recorded, so Juliet was super excited when she did her. So we went and recorded her second video with her LOL dolls present, where she does the blindfold part of the challenge, and I describe the books to her, but I'll wait a little while before putting it up because I know lots of people are there for the fantasy books and not necessarily my 8-year-old, but we did want to close the loop. So we'll put that one up in a couple of weeks probably.
Aw, that sounds fun. Yay.
It was fun. They were definitely two of like the most fun to record.
Oh, and are they both into books?
They are both into books. Juliet, it kind of exploded last year. She still really likes being read to. So longer middle grade books, she still wants us to read together. So there's still some books that we'll read before bed, but she loves reading and she goes through books really quickly. So we're often having to go and exchange them at the library. Isaac does really like reading, but he's more into comic books right now. And I think like the very typical comic books that a lot of boys his age like Captain Underpants and Dogman. And there's another one called Investigators where there's like 2 alligators who are investigating things. And so he likes the comic books, but he did get a couple of shorter novels for Christmas that he is starting to like, but he also still enjoys being read to. So if we're going to do anything longer, then it'll usually be me reading it to them. But they both really like books. Somehow, and Juliet bemoans this fact all the time, is that she is a very fancy girl born to a very unfancy mom. So sometimes the things that she wants to read about are not like the topics of books that I own. Like a lot of my childhood books have dragons or creatures or those things, and she wants like fashion and all of those types of subjects. So we have to go and get books that fill that desire for her. But Isaac is more into the fantasy side of things. We just started watching Avatar, The Last Airbender, the cartoon, which I've actually never watched. I've watched Korra, which is like the older show, and really loved it, but I had never watched Avatar, so we're watching it together. And Juliet likes it. Like she enjoys watching it, but I think she might like it more for the family experience. But Isaac loves it. Like he is
it's so good. Yeah, I loved that show.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard that the Legends of Korra isn't quite as good, but I have not watched that.
So that is definitely the popular opinion. I watched Korra first. So I think part of the magic of like learning about the world and the bending and all that came for the first time from Korra for me. And some of the things about Korra that I think some people don't like are things that I do like. So it's a little bit more romance focused, which I do enjoy. Like I like that thread of romance and things. And I don't mind some of the plot difficulties or the plot conveniences that people don't tend to like about Korra. I'm very forgiving of them. So I really, really like Korra. And I think we are halfway through season 1 or like book 1. And I think I'm probably going to like Korra more by the end. Some people are not convinced that this is true. They think once I get in and through all of Avatar that I will prefer it, but I'm thinking that that's not the case. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on that. Cool. Yeah, I really enjoyed that show though. I haven't watched a whole lot of cartoon type of shows, but that one is really good. And I also love Death Note too. That's another one that actually that's one of my favorite shows, probably. Death Note. Have you ever watched that?
So my very unpopular anime opinion is that I don't like Death Note very much. I'm sorry, but almost everybody does. People love it. So you are not alone in that. I do not love Death Note. It is an unpopular anime opinion, but I do love watching anime. So there's lots that I like for sure.
Yeah. I've never read the manga either, but I enjoyed the show. Cool.
We have the manga series, but my husband, you reach a certain point where there is like a turning point in the series and he just stopped reading them after that. He's watched the whole show. But after that point in the manga, he was like, nope, I am done.
I've heard that. I've heard a lot of people get turned off on the manga after a certain point, that it stops being as good. So I actually heard the show was better than the manga, but I don't know if that's true or not.
And that could be true. I'm not sure, but I have tried to finish Death Note 2 times and I cannot make it through the whole show. And I don't know. It's very edgy. There's a very edgy element to Death Note. And sometimes that's super entertaining, but it just did not entertain me.
I really shouldn't have loved it because it is very hard magic. I'm also not really a big rule by the rules kind of based type of fantasy reader. I tend to prefer magic on the soft side.
Mhm.
For whatever reason, I really loved it, but it has been a while too. Yeah. Uh, oh, yeah. So it looks like Alan agrees with that. um,
But it does appeal to that grimdark sensibility that you like. Like you do enjoy exploring those like darker topics in fiction.
I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't really want to be the grimdark girl, but it just feels like that's what's happened to me over time.
Mhm. That's okay.
Like over Christmas time, like, what am I doing? I'm just reading nothing but nihilistic books, and that's not necessarily what I was going for with my brand, but
Mhm. But it works. It
what
works
ended
well.
up happening. So yeah, it's kind of funny the way that works out. Your husband reads a lot of fantasy as well?
He does. I would say what he reads is exclusively fantasy. He just doesn't read as much as like the typical person on BookTube would read. He goes through spurts where sometimes he will read like 4 or 5 books in a month, and then one book might take him through a couple of months. He'll also read web novels sometimes. He just finished this really popular one that's called Worm, which is a superhero based web novel, which is gigantic. But he is whatever the opposite of a prose snob is. Like he does not care, which is
Hmm.
why things like web novels will work really well for him because he does not care. Not to say that there aren't web novels with excellent prose. I'm sure there are, but it's not usually the focus. Like it's usually more about getting the story out and these big twists and turns and kind of epic things. And Andrew is like very unabashedly a fan of classic tropes and happy endings. He's like, the world is sad. I don't need my books to be sad too. So he is definitely a happy ending kind of person. There are things that I have read that I think stylistically or based on the topic that he would really like, but he will never read them because they're just too dark and he doesn't want it. He
Yeah.
wants things to be happy.
I think that that's pretty typical for a lot of people who read fantasy, though. I mean,
Mhm.
you definitely want, conflict and challenge and things like that, but I think a lot of people come to the genre initially because of that. They want the happy ending, I would assume. But of course,
Yes.
there's a lot of fantasy that doesn't do that nowadays. Um, yeah, that's interesting. My husband, I would have expected him not to be like that, not to be a prose snob at all, especially because he is so introverted and so quiet and he doesn't talk a lot. And
Mhm.
it's totally the opposite. Once I started getting to know his taste in fantasy, he like did not really resonate with Brandon Sanderson's prose. And he loved Name of the Wind and he loved Farseer.
Mhm.
Yeah, it turned out he was very particular about writing style and it's just the things you learn about people through what they read. It's so interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Um, let's see. So yeah, would I recommend The Prince of Nothing for Sarah? I don't know. That's a hard one. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe. Uh, that one is very nihilistic and it doesn't have the hope, it doesn't have the heart, it doesn't have the whimsy, the wonder that I think a lot of fantasy readers want to gravitate towards. It's the reason why I did love it, but at the same time, it's just not a series I can universally recommend for that reason. And I have to be very careful. And I think that was why I felt like I had to be so careful about the review, because that was another thing too, whereas like I really enjoyed this series, but do I recommend it? Keep in mind this list of things.
Mhm.
So it's hard to say. It's hard to say. But I did think it was phenomenal. I mean, I thought if you like somebody with a good prose style, Baker
Mhm.
is an incredible writer. I think he has an incredible style and an amazing command of the language, incredible quotable passages left and right.
Mhm.
But at the same time, it's readable. It's very readable. But I don't think
I
it's going to
am
be for everyone.
I am intrigued, but I'm not a particularly anxious person, and I say this coming from a family of very anxious people. The one thing that does make me feel really anxious is that that kind of like nihilistic sense of impending oblivion. And sometimes I will read things and it definitely will get me in my head for a while afterwards. which is not made any better. I don't know if I think this is something that is like common to many kids. I don't know if anyone else who is a parent who's listening can identify, but literally, and because I come from an anxious family, my children can be somewhat anxious sometimes too. And without fail, if I lie down with my son at nighttime, it is the perfect time for him to be like, Mom, how many years till you're dead? And I'm like, thank you, Isaac. That's exactly what I wanted to think about at 8:30 at night in the dark. Thank you. I'll carry this thought through to my bed later when I'm trying to fall asleep at 10:30. So sometimes if I read about that in books, it will get me like inside my head for a little while. And I am overall like a pretty optimistic person, which I try to rein in sometimes, because I know like the whole toxic positivity thing can be very difficult for a lot of people, and this like emphasis on things always being happy and always being good. And I think in some ways you can't choose how you're like how that outlook is going to be. Like there's a lot of factors that go into that. But for example, if I look back on a period of time, let's say I look back on a vacation or something that happened and there were like bad things and good things, I will almost never remember the bad things that happened, even if they were really frustrating in the moment. I'll be like, remember when we did this, Andrew, and it was like awesome, and we did these things? He's like, are you kidding me? Like we got lost and this got stolen and then this happened. I'm like, oh yeah, like there were some kind of bad things that happened too, but they don't ever really come back. And I don't necessarily like reading things where things are really bleak and dark, even though I know that perspective is important. And I know that it is only because I have lived a very, very, very privileged life that I even have the option of feeling optimistic and happy a lot of the time. I know that's important to get that other viewpoint, but sometimes it just makes me feel sad.
I know, I totally understand that. Yeah, I can totally understand that. I know that, I mean, I feel like this is different for me now, but I know for a long time, as far as my reading taste is concerned, I would have a very difficult time following a character. If it builds to this, it's a different thing, but I would have a very difficult time picking up a book, reading about a depressed character, a character who's just down. Even if I knew that would change over time, like I cannot live with this. Like I can't do it. I just can't do it. It was the reason why, oh, that's probably a spoiler. Well, Harry Potter, there's a book of Harry Potter, Harry Potter book 5. I'll just say the beginning of that was kind of a downer for me.
Yes. Yeah.
That book just kind of brought me down. I felt like I could relate too much. So, so yeah, I don't know. It's not usually a perspective I want to explore that much. And I found that a lot of times, I mean, Prince of Nothing is kind of an exceptional read for me, because a lot of times when I read grimdark, and I haven't read very many grimdark books, but the grimdark that I have read is like Abercrombie, and it's where it doesn't take itself too seriously. So it's got a lightheartedness to it. It has a humor to it.
Yes, the balance is there. I love the balance in Abercrombie. It doesn't ever make me feel like I'm not left at the end of the book feeling desolate. Like there's enough humor there that it balances things, and that's what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
But I do want to try Baker, just to, I find it really hard when all my friends like something to not want to like it. I am the opposite of a book hipster. If everyone that I know has read it and loved it, I want to read it and love it too.
Yeah, and I'm kind of the opposite of like a book recommender. I'm like, I don't know if you should read this book, because I would just hate for you to read something and hate it. But I would be curious about your thoughts on at least the first book, if you picked it up, just because there's a character, without giving away a lot. I know people are very like shy about spoilers and everything. I'm trying not to spoil anything, but there is a character who's a very good manipulator, who's able to read micro expressions and use that to their benefit. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that character and how effective you think Baker is at exploring that type of manipulation.
I will definitely give it a try.
Yeah. And the characters, I mean, that is something I really appreciated too about your reviews in general, but like just even thinking back to, I think it was your review of Best Served Cold, you did like an analysis, like you were able to do psychiatric diagnosis of like certain characters. Like, say one of them had a certain type of narcissism or whatever, and
Mhm.
so I'd be curious. The characters in there are pretty grim in a way. Like, they're not the
Sometimes that can be fun. I do try to be careful and just go by the books. But it is fun to speculate sometimes on fictional people.
Yeah, yeah. It would be interesting. It would be interesting to hear your thoughts on some of those characters. But yeah, it's a series that I just can't universally recommend for so many reasons. If Sarah hates Sam Vine, I will never read Robin Hobb. Is there a character like that for you in fantasy where you feel like this is me in fantasy form? Like Alan has with Sam Vine?
I don't know. And this comes up a lot because you always get the like these are the characters that I identify with. And usually it's like I like the bookish characters, and I can identify with characters like that, like Jane Eyre, for example. That, and she's just coming to mind because that's what I'm reading right now. But people who are more bookish and their focus is on that kind of like scholarly appreciation, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't know which character I feel like I would identify with that would encompass all the parts of my personality. And I
Yeah.
do think about it. And it's not even like this is like a question that catches you off guard, because it's one that comes up all the time. And every time I think about it, I can never come up with great answers. I like, there are characters that I would like to think there are bits of them in me, and that I think that's more like admiration and wanting those characters. Like, I would like to believe that were I in a fantasy setting, I could be like Orca and be that like absolute badass of a mom who's gonna like save your family and do all that stuff. But do I think that I am like that? No. I have the upper body strength of a mollusk. Like, there's no way that I could save anyone from anything, but I would like to think that I could. So I don't know. It's a really hard question for me. Sometimes you get people who just identify with characters like that. And I think it is hard to, because if we look at like traditional gender roles, which I don't subscribe to a whole lot, but in fiction, you'll get people that are in certain roles and they're either trying to break free of that role or they're trying to do something different. The things that I do in my life, like in our house, it is a very like flipped scenario of what you typically get. Like, Andrew is a stay-at-home dad. I am the person who is out working all the time. Like, he is the person who was home with the kids like their whole lives from the time I was in med school and then in residency. So I didn't get any time off after pregnancy. Like, I worked until I had my baby, and then I had to go right back afterwards, because even though there is paid parental leave in Canada, taking a break in training was not really an option. So it's a weird setup. And I just think that sometimes some of the things that happen to women in books, I can't relate to a lot. Now, this is getting better because obviously books are becoming more diverse and we get women doing like a whole host of things. So I think in modern fantasy and modern fiction, there are probably more characters that I can relate to. And that's why I brought up Orca, because I just think that she's cool. But I also think sometimes when people try to subvert that, they just make their female characters do things that are seen as like stereotypically masculine and be like very strong and gruff and aggressive. And I'm also not like that. Like, there's some like weird in between place. So the best that I can ever do is like, yes, the bookie person, but we're all bookie people. So we probably all identify with that. I need to get a good answer. I need to find a good answer. Also, I need to answer a question one time in any stream with a concise response.
No, I love your
I feel
answers.
like I just
No,
keep
no.
going all
I
the
love it.
time.
I love hearing what you have to say. So, yeah, it's interesting because I listened to I mentioned this in my stoner review. I listened to a wonderful interview with, it was actually a House of Chains discussion with Stephen Erickson, author of Moth's
Mhm.
Book of Fawn, and he was saying, he said this actually in a previous video as well. He said this a couple of times about how when he's thinking of writing good characters, that there has to be some level, and I'm paraphrasing here, but some level of contradiction in characters in order
Yes.
to make them more well realized,
Mhm.
because none of us are 100% consistent all of the time. In fact, I think he even kind of has a way of portraying that in Malazan too. The dangers of being 100% consistent all the time, because we do
Mhm.
have conflicting influences in our lives. So,
Absolutely.
for example, even with Orca, she's really strong in some points, but she's also vulnerable in other parts. She's a tough mom at
Mhm.
times too. She isn't just the mom who's, you know, all heart and all her, so I think that there were some nuances there. So I think that that's important to consider with any character that we identify with too, that maybe they're not going to be, sometimes we perceive ourselves as being 100% something all the time, but we aren't. None of us really are.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I would say, and because here, I mean, answering this, I mean, I did mention that in Stoner too. I mean, I specifically mentioned that quote in my Stoner review because I do think that we see some contradictions in Stoner's character. I don't think, I mean, I think what I love about that book, without giving too much away, is I feel like there's a lot of space for the reader to infer what that character is about and wonder about things. So I don't feel like it was that for me all, but I could see that angle too. So I don't feel like it's hard for me because I feel like this is a character I couldn't necessarily is distinct, but at the same time not cookie cutter. So I feel like saying Stoner is depressed. I don't feel like that would be accurate for me. Let's see. Read what with I guess I missed that. Sorry. I'd be curious. Yeah, is Sarah bullying Alan by not saying her opinions? I think it's kind of been the opposite.
It has been the opposite.
Ah. Oh, we've been going for a while. We've actually been going for almost like 2.5 hours, a little over 2.5 hours now. Oh no, I didn't know that Evie did not like Jane Eyre.
I will say, Evie, if you're still in the chat, my experience of reading it for the second time, now that I know what happens, is a very different experience. I feel very differently about certain characters, certain scenarios than I did the first time I read it, but that makes it great. That is, I think, the mark of a good book.
Yeah. It never goes well for me if Evie doesn't like a book. Because a lot of times the books that Evie doesn't, or if Evie loves a book, the chances are very high that I will love a book. Unfortunately, it doesn't work the other way around. There have been books that I've really enjoyed that I don't think she's liked as much, but she does a good, if she doesn't like a book, that's kind of scary a little bit. So
She's a very discerning palate.
She does. She has a very discerning palate. She has that. I think I'm at a cross between Granny and Susan from Discworld. I don't think I've met those characters. But
I love Susan. Susan is the best. Being like Susan is the highest compliment. I think Susan's a bit too practical for me to be like her because I am not that practical. My head is in the clouds more than Susan's for sure.
Interesting. Yeah. Oddly, and I know Evie and I feel the same way about this. I'm going to speak for you, Evie. I found myself identifying a little bit with Fitz from Farseer, at least in book 1 and some in book 2. I think that changed throughout the trilogy. But yeah, that surprised me, especially for a male character, obviously written by an amazing author, but it was strange to see myself in this young character. Let's see here. Did I already highlight that? I do not have many characters I relate to, but when I do, people call them naive and not adult enough. Interesting. Well, I just said I kind of relate to Fitz, and everybody's always talking about what an idiot Fitz is. So I don't know what that means about me.
The way that I'm going to score points with Juliet tomorrow is by telling her that Angela was here because she is obsessed with Angela. Not to put any pressure on you, Angela, but she is. I'm pretty sure Angela's #1 fan. So.
Wow, that's fantastic. Yay.
Yeah, she will ask to watch her videos, and she'll like specifically get they get a certain amount of screen time, and she will use hers to watch Angela on BookTube. She's their new Angela video. She knows they come up on Friday too, that she talks about her Friday read stuff. So she's a big Angela fan.
So Sarah, what about, how do you say that name?
Andromache. Yeah, she's an excellent character. She's so good. And she is a perfect balance of feminine and masculine and cunning. So she definitely subverts expectations of her. One of my favorite female fantasy characters ever, and like favorite fantasy characters. She's so well done. I love her character.
Yeah. When Fitz does really dumb things. Yeah, I think so. In particular, I'm thinking about Mara from Nettle and Bone. Yeah, I'm trying to think of that character, what that character is like. That is actually that's the main character in Nettle and Bone, I think, Angela, if I'm correct. I thought that was actually a very well-written character. It was a very well written and it was a character that, I don't feel like we see a lot of in fantasy in general because this is a character who's just very genuine and sincere and just has a good heart.
Mhm.
And I feel like writing a character like that is actually kind of difficult to do, but I think that Kingfisher pulled that off pretty well. Yeah, we love that video of your daughter. It's so cute. That's awesome that she thinks of Angela as a hero. That's wonderful. Yay. Fantastic.
Yeah, I think her greatest wish in life, whenever Angela asks about book recommendations on her video, she's always like, put in CC Rios. One day, Angela will read CC Rios, which is this middle grade book about a girl, and it is inspired. I don't remember like where the direct inspiration comes from, but it like there is like their family speaks Spanish, and it's about like spirits, and there are animal spirits, and it's really fun. We read it together, but she is convinced that this will be a book that Angela loves, and I think her dream of life is to hear Angela talk about it.
Aw. Isn't that always our dream with people we love? We just want them to read a book that we really love. Like, please read
Yes.
this book. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Except I've come to the opposite end of that. I'm like scared of people I love reading books I
You
love
don't want them to dislike
because I'm
it.
so scared they won't love them. Although it really surprised me because, like I said, I mean, Stoner was my favorite book of last year, and I
Mhm.
kept thinking everybody's gonna think I'm insane, and that's fine, but people are just gonna think I'm insane, and I was so surprised how many people actually shared their love of Stoner,
Yeah.
especially in this corner of BookTube. So I don't know, maybe I'm not insane, but we'll see. I hope you like it, and I hope I'm not building expectations
I
over
think
it.
I will. I really liked Augustus, and outside of the fact that, history is cool in general, I didn't have any particular preference for Roman history. I didn't know that much about it beyond what you learn in Julius Caesar, the play. So
Yeah.
I didn't really know anything else, and I loved it. So
Yeah. Yeah. That's cool. Yeah. I can
I think
understand
I
that
cured
feeling.
myself of this really early by loving The Dark Tower, because
Ah,
especially pre-booktube, because once I got on booktube, I found more people who actually liked The Dark Tower. But just knowing people, which is, I only talked to other people in my life about books for a really long time. Everybody seemed to hate The Dark Tower. And
mm.
I built up a skin, I guess. I just expected people to dislike the fantasy books that I enjoyed from a young age. So now it's okay if they don't.
That's where I feel like non-spoiler reviews can come in handy. I do think
Mhm.
that because I did have I mean, I had watched some non-spoiler reviews of people who had read The Dark Tower. I think it helps with a series like that is that
Mhm.
experimental to know what you're getting into. If you go into that one blind, I don't know, I guess it just depends on where you're at with your reading journey. I could see how people who were reading it when it was being published, were you one of those? Were you reading it when it was being published?
Not for all of them, but post book 4.
Ah, because I could see, like, how that could be, um, a challenge for some
Mhm.
people, having certain expectations, possibly, I don't know. Which one is your favorite book in the series again? Was it the last one?
It's actually the first one.
Oh, that's right, the first one. Oh, okay, cool. That's
I
cool.
do love book 4 as well, Wizard and Glass, which is a pretty popular favorite. I really like the stuff that takes place in the past, but I love The Gunslinger. I know a lot of people really don't like it, but that's okay.
Right.
I like it.
Yeah. I liked it. I mean, I liked it. I think I didn't love it on the level I was hoping to love it, but I think that was just where I was at the time. But I'd heard my brother talk nonstop about you need to read the Dark Tower series for so many years before I read it. So I think I might have had some expectations or unrealistic expectations of what I was getting into, but I think I would love it more on a reread for sure.
Mhm.
And I actually liked Song of Susanna. I know people hate that one, but
Which I do think to a certain degree is because of how they came out, like just the weight. And then it is a book that is made better by having the seventh book on hand to go into as soon as you can.
Yeah. Yeah. I need to read some more Stephen King. I know you mentioned The Talisman in a recent video, and that's one that's been on my shelf forever that I need to get to at some point.
This
But
is a book that I am scared to read because so many people dislike it and so many Stephen King fans dislike it. And I loved it. It was the first Stephen King book that I ever read. So I read it before I read The Dark Tower, or before I read The Gunslinger. I read The Gunslinger pretty soon afterwards. But I read The Talisman really young and loved it. I think I was 12 when I read it, and the main character is 12 in the book, which I guess in my dad's mind was like, this is a 12-year-old. I can give it to my 12-year-old too. But I just liked it so much when I read it back then, and I haven't reread it, and I don't know if I'll love it as much now. And that makes me scared because in my heart, I hold a lot of fondness for it.
yeah, I'm worried about that too. And I feel like I need to read it because it was gifted to me from my brother who loves the book.
Mm-hmm.
I actually come from a family of King lovers.
Nice.
Both my parents, and well, my sister hasn't read a ton of King. She's read a few here and there, but my
Mm-hmm.
two brothers have read tons of King, and my parents have read tons of King. And so it was really fun. I visited them about a year ago, and we just had a big King conversation. And I asked them about all the King they read. And it was interesting because every single one of them have read different King books. There was like some crossover, but I was amazed how many different King books everyone had read. And
Because
just
it's
hearing their
amazing how many books he has. Like his bibliography is so extensive.
mind blowing how prolific he is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. That was my well, I read The Gunslinger and then I read 11/22/63.
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk about that in a video at some point, talk more about my experience with that book because I know that that's not one that Sarah loved. She liked it but didn't love it, but
I
I
did
think
like it. I did, but time travel is not my favorite
Mhm,
thing, and I know that you really like time travel, but I
mhm.
do love I did like the slice of life style stuff that was in there, and reading it after having read it also made me love certain portions of the book too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very special book for me. I think part of that too is that I grew up with Back to the Future on loop in my house growing up. So
Mhm.
I did love time travel as a result of that movie, but also especially time traveling specifically to the 50s. And of course we go into the 60s there too. I think it was just handled so brilliantly. I loved that book. And
Right? And it is hard to find. I also did not meet many people who had even read The Dark Tower.
yeah, that's nice though that there is such a huge community of people who are loving that and loving King.
And the good thing about Dark Tower is the people who love it love it. Like they are very passionate in their love for it. So it makes up for the fact that some people don't. And it's a weird series. Like you said, I understand if people don't like it. It is one that is going to appeal to a very specific taste. You have to enjoy fantasy. You have to enjoy Stephen King's weird brain. You have to be okay with things going off in really strange tangents. I also think that an appreciation for Arthurian legend helps you appreciate the book too. Like
Oh,
there are certain things that go into liking The Dark Tower, and it just happens to tick all those things.
yeah, I agree completely. All right, we'll see you later, Alan. Thanks for coming and bullying us in the chat. We love you. Yeah. And Dresden Files, yeah, I'm still curious about that. I started talking about that with Jake Bishop when he was here on the stream, and then that ended up going for a while because he loves talking about Dresden Files. I need to bring him back to talk about it sometime, but I don't know. I'm really nervous about urban fantasy.
Mhm.
I feel like I don't know. A good author can prove me wrong about anything. And there are even urban fantasy elements in the Dark Tower series, and I loved those parts, or most of those parts, I should say.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I'm curious. I'm curious about Dresden Files. I want to see what the hype is, but at the same time, I'm so nervous. It might not be for me. Yeah. Guy Gabrielle Kay and the Dresden Files. And I know I have you in a conversation, Jake.
Can go for hours.
Yeah. But I am going to read The Lions of Alrasan. That's going to be my entry point into Guy Gabrielle Kay
Mhm.
based on Jake's recommendation. So, And then I'll read Tigana because I do own that.
Afterward, I don't know what I'm gonna do. Part of me is tempted to go back and just start from the beginning, which I think is Finnevar, and maybe just like make my way through then chronologically, and or maybe not. I don't know. Jake will tell me what to do. Once I'm ready to put another GGK book on my TBR, he'll let me know what I
I'm
have
so
to do.
excited. I loved your Tigana review so much. And I'm really excited though because I have been in books. I was in a used bookstore that had a few GJK books on the shelf. And
Mhm.
I just opened up a few and read the first paragraph of a few. And I was thinking, my goodness, I love his writing style just based
Yes.
on a couple of short paragraphs. There's something so beautiful about the way he writes. What is my hesitance about urban fantasy? That's a good question. I think it's just like a vibe thing, you know?
No thoughts, just vibes.
You know, where did I hear that? Somebody was saying that recently. Bookborn. Bookborn was saying it's a vibe thing about fantasy versus sci-fi. I don't know because like I said, I think like in The Dark Tower, specifically book 2, there in King introduced some urban fantasy elements into that book. And
Mhm.
that completely hooked me. I loved that part without
Yep.
giving anything away. Um, so I think a good author could prove me wrong about things. I did enjoy Ninth House by Lee Bardugo, and I would consider that possibly urban fantasy.
Mhm.
So there are some exceptions here and there, but for some reason, I think it's like I really don't know what it is. I really couldn't even tell you. Uh, I know that I didn't really care as much for Jade City as most people know, and
Mhm.
I might try to reread it at some point, see if I can give it another try. But something about the guns in fantasy settings, it's very hit or miss. Again, the gunslinger, it worked there. I don't know. But also, I know a huge draw for her for I almost said Harry Potter for the Dresden Files is that a lot of people who love the Dresden Files, I feel like, also loved. This is going to be one of my more unpopular opinions. They also loved Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I never really liked Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
What?
I
Joanne,
know.
I don't even know what to say to that. I'm flabbergasted.
I don't know. I mean, I never. To be fair, I never really gave it a fair shot. I've just seen parts of an episode here and there.
Mhm.
So I've never watched. I don't even know if I've ever watched a full episode of Buffy, but I think it's more that actress who plays Buffy. Something
Mhm.
about her just came across pretentious to me, and I just couldn't get past it. So I never got into the show.
So
So I don't know, but it never appealed to me. Like something about that just never was exciting to me for some reason.
I remember the exact moment that I saw the first like minute of Buffy the Vampire Slayer that I ever watched, which was there's a praying mantis episode in season 1,
Oh,
and we found this episode, we being me and my dad, and watched the rest of the episode and then found out that it was Buffy and then started watching it every Monday after that, which I think it might be like 4 or 5 episodes into season 1, so we missed the first few the first time that we watched it through, and then we were hooked from that one episode, and then we watched them all for the next,
wait a minute. Are you saying
7.
she turned into a praying mantis?
She doesn't. There is an individual who turns into a praying mantis. The first season is a really campy in a good way, I think. But it is in the first season, there's a lot of that like ridiculous. It becomes much more serious as the seasons go by. But the first season in particular has that kind of campiness, which is really enjoyable.
I might give it a shot.
The first season
Well,
is full of interesting ones. Like there's like a swim team beach monster, there's a praying mantis, there's what else is in season 1 that is
I
just
didn't
off the wall ridiculous. There's a lot, but season 1 is funny.
I didn't realize that praying mantis would be a buzzword for me until just now. I think you just picked Buffy the Vampire
It's
Slayer by
interesting to learn about you. We're learning about the things about you and your aggressive tendencies.
my God, I kind of can look like a praying mantis in this shirt.
It fits with the assassin aesthetic. You tell your husband to watch himself.
I'm really thinking about giving it a shot sometime though. Maybe I'll
Excellent.
try
Even if you only start with the praying mantis episode like I did, then please do.
Maybe I'll be sold then. Maybe I'll be sold then. Yeah, no, I think though the reason part of it though is getting into fantasy. I guess I mean, growing up, I'm trying to think because like when I first got into fantasy, especially as a teenager, even as a kid, it was with not only things like Lord of the Rings, but also movies, the Never Ending Story movie and book in that case. Same
Mhm.
with the Princess Bride movie and book, the Last Unicorn
Mhm.
movie and book. Um, there's another one I'm not thinking about, Legend. I mean, there are several of them, right? And
Yeah.
so I think I just, I know people with modern fantasy these days, they want unusual and different type of settings, and I think that's fun too, and I like that too. But I have always liked the medieval and naturistic, like that's not a word, but natural. Sorry, it's late. I'm not talking well. Natural setting, historic vibe to fantasy. I can't think of
Yes.
what I'm trying to say. Sorry,
I
words are
understand. I understand. It's okay.
Yeah, so I think that I've always kind of like I've always enjoyed or been drawn to that, to more of a historic feel
Mhm.
and more of a connection with nature. So when I'm in a city and with guns and magic,
Mhm.
I don't know. I don't know if it's something I get into. I love sci-fi though.
Yeah.
So I
I
don't know.
understand. I also prefer classic with that kind of nature feeling to fantasy over urban fantasy. It is Dresden is very much the exception for me. I have not read a lot of other urban fantasy. And for
Yeah.
some reason it feels different on TV. Like Buffy, I I don't associate like I know that Buffy is fantastic because there are monsters, but for some reason it doesn't even register as fantasy in my mind. I don't know if that's just because I don't watch a lot of TV. So I probably haven't watched enough to even categorize. I'm like in my mind, TV is either anime or not. Like that's
Yeah.
basically how it gets categorized in my brain. But I don't lump Buffy in with the other fantasy that I have consumed, which is mostly in book form.
Yeah, I mean, and then there's the paranormal versus supernatural, and
Mhm.
what is that, and how is that distinguished from urban fantasy
Mhm.
versus fantasy in general, or magical realism? Just distinguishing all these different categories is confusing, and that's why I'm like always thinking of exceptions to everything I say. There's
Mhm.
always going to be an exception, always for everything.
No,
I've often
absolutely.
said that about dystopian too. I'm like, I don't think I really like dystopian books. But then is Gunslinger, would that be considered dystopian? I think it would.
I think
So,
so. At least part of it. At the very
yeah.
least, like post-apocalyptic.
Yeah. So there are definitely exceptions to that too. I can think of, exceptions to basically everything I think I don't like.
Mhm.
If it's a good author, if it's well written, usually there's an exception.
Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't yet read, let's see. Hyperion is just okay. I haven't yet read it. Joanna, you might like Iron Druid because he gets his power from the earth, very centered. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. It's hard for me to even know my own taste sometimes.
And urban fantasy is usually a commitment. Like the books individually can be shorter than epic fantasy, but there's always so many. You'll see these urban fantasy series, and they'll be like book 39 of this series. Like, whoa.
That is a lot. That's a huge commitment. You're right. Yeah, absolutely. And also, Sarah, I am biased and would like another really good GGK book because I will enjoy your reactions.
That's
Yeah,
true.
and
I will read whichever one you tell me to next, Jake. You can pick the one that I read next.
100 years? Is it 100 years or is it 1,000 years? I thought it was 1,000 years. Maybe it's 100 years.
100
100
Years
Years
of Solitude.
Solitude? Okay. Have you read that one?
Yep. I have. I've read his two like bigger books. I've read 100 Years of Solitude and I've read Love in the Time of Cholera.
Yeah. Anime or not? What anime do you like, Sarah? Sarah, I mean, you probably read more manga than watch anime, is that correct?
No, actually it's the opposite. So I
Oh,
have finished very few manga series. I have finished some series where I started the anime and then the anime had not caught up to where the manga was. So then I finished out the manga. but I've read very few complete manga series, whereas I've liked anime for a really long time. But the only thing about my anime opinions is that they're really boring because I like the same things that everybody else likes. Like my favorites are Cowboy Bebop, which is super popular, Full Metal Alchemist, which also is like everybody else's favorite. I really like Attack on Titan, even though like everyone else, I'm not the biggest fan of the ending. Surprising to me because I didn't think that I was really that into sports anime. I actually really loved Haikyuu. I watched it. I don't think it was last year. I think it was the year before last, right when I got on BookTube. This is actually how Patrick and I became such good friends, is because I had commented on one of his videos and we chatted about something. And then I started watching Haikyuu, and he was the only other person that I had known who had watched it. So I flooded him with so many messages. And as I was doing, I was like, this person is going to think that you're unhinged. Like there's something wrong with the number of messages that you are sending him. And thankfully it turned into like a very nice friendship and not a restraining order, but there were a lot of messages there. So I really like Haikyuu. That is a favorite. I watched the anime Banana Fish for the first time last year, which I loved, but it is very specific to my personal taste. So unless you also really like the things that I like, then it might not be the one for you. But those are some of my favorites.
That's cool. I have not watched a lot of anime, but when I got into anime with some friends when I was in high school. I had a friend who was really into it, like really into anime. And she got my friends and I at the time, my friend group and I at the time, to watch this really, really weird anime that I never hear people talk about, but there are like a zillion episodes of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's called Ranma One Half.
Yes, I think the person who made that also made Inuyasha. Maybe I'm not.
You've
I
heard
want
of
to look
it?
this up
I've
now.
never
Yes,
heard anybody talk about that.
because I think isn't the premise that someone changes their gender? Maybe.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
So it's about this character named Ranma. Shoot, I'm
Mhm.
getting it again. Hold on one second.
I just want to see if this person is the same person who wrote
Okay.
Inuyasha.
My echo is gone. So this
Yes, it is.
this character Ranma, it's a male character, and he's with his father, and he's training. I want to say they're training in China, but I could be wrong about that. Anyway,
Mhm.
there are all these cursed wells. And so he falls into their specific cursed wells, and he falls into the cursed well of young girl. And so anytime he gets hit with water, it might be hot water or cold water, I don't remember, he
Mhm.
turns into a girl. And
Right.
anytime he gets hit with hot water, I think it's hot water anyway. I can't remember exactly. He turns back into a boy, and his
Mhm.
father turns into cursed well of panda bears. So every time his dad gets wet, he turns into a panda bear. And so then they end up coming together with some friends who,
Mhm.
the friend who Ranma is supposed to be betrothed to some young girl, and he shows up first as a girl, and then they end up in the bath together, and all is revealed, and it just gets insane though.
There's
And
always
it's
weird things
so
that happen in anime. Like you'll love something, and then there will be an episode. Like there is an anime that I really love that is really, really good, but also really super weird. And it's really hard to recommend to people because they'll watch it, they'll be like, they're gonna actually think that there's something wrong with you.
Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the anime Ranma is so raunchy, like, it is
Mhm.
super raunchy in places, and so
Yes.
my friends and I watched it, but we didn't take it seriously at the same time. It was just kinda, like, comical for us. So
Yes.
so it was almost like people would play, like, a drinking game, like, take a shot every time Ranma and his father beat each other up, or, get wet, or every time Ranma turns into a girl. It was just like we were just ridiculous with it. But, yeah, it's just a very raunchy, silly, ridiculous show that you cannot take seriously. Otherwise, yeah, it's not gonna sit well with you probably.
No, anime can get wild like that. I really liked the first season of Vinland Saga. I really, really loved it. I know season 2 is either out or some of the episodes are coming out. I don't remember if it came out as a full release or if it's going weekly. I do want to watch season 2, but season 1 was excellent and it could become a favorite for sure.
Awesome. Have you read the manga?
Only the first volume.
Ah, yes. Oh,
Yeah,
it's so
only
good.
the first volume.
I've read up to I've read through the first 2 arcs of, Vinland Saga, but I
Right.
have not watched the show. I watched part of the first episode,
Mhm.
and I thought it was beautiful. it is absolutely stunning, the actual anime, but
Mhm.
I think the one thing I was preferring the reason I was preferring the manga over the anime, and not to say this is bad or that they shouldn't have done this, they probably did this for good reason, but
Mhm.
the anime takes the story in a much more linear timeline, whereas
Yes.
the manga does a different timeline. It does things in a nonlinear way, and I actually prefer that. I just prefer that, I think, in general,
In
maybe?
general.
I don't know if
Mhm.
that's true. I think it just depends on how it's done, but for me, it really worked that way, so it was kinda hard to switch back to a linear format.
Mhm.
But it did look stunning, so I might have to go back and watch it.
The action sequences were so good in Vinland Saga. It made me want more fighting to happen. I was like, people need to fight again because this looks so good.
Yeah, it was so good. Yeah, I haven't watched all of their talks on it, but it was fun to see Philip get excited about manga.
About manga. Yes, I will definitely go back and watch those once I read them. I agree. Berserk will probably become a new favorite, and I do need to actually read it, and I will, in fact, read it this year, Colton. So it's gonna happen.
I need to read Berserk, and, was Monster another one that you had read? I can't
Monster
remember.
I'm in the middle of right now with Jimmy. We're
Ah,
reading that one and hoping to do a chat about it. And that's why I have not watched the anime yet, is because I am in the middle of reading the manga.
cool. Very cool. Yeah.
One that I really like, which is kind of outside the usual wheelhouse of like epic fantasy. So there is an anime called Yona of the Dawn that's based on a manga. And it's so good. It's very it's like a classic quest style fantasy. The main character is a princess, and she grew up in a kingdom where her father, the king, is a pacifist and he doesn't believe in violence. And at the very beginning, this is not a spoiler, this is how the show is described, is that he is assassinated because people think that he's too passive and their kingdom is kind of like falling behind. And so she has to escape, and she goes on a quest to find these legendary beings who can help her regain her kingdom. And so because she grew up in this household where her dad was so um I guess passive, she didn't learn a whole lot about how to defend herself. She's very naive. She's going out in the world, and it has excellent character growth. And I don't know why the anime only ever got one season. I think it just got released at a time when that style of anime was not as popular. And it is a real shame because I really like the story and the anime was excellent.
Oh, yeah. Cool. I'll have to check that out. I would like to get more into anime. I with Vinland Saga, I've been checking those out from the library, and I have to do
Mhm.
it on interlibrary loan, so they take a long while to get here.
Oh no.
No, it's fine, it's fine. It just takes a little while. So, I think I've been going very slowly through that, but I would like to pick up more anime or more manga for that not anime, but manga,
Mhm.
and yeah, I would really am curious about Berserk and some other ones, so I may check that out, and I know One Piece is super, super popular.
It is, and I have for a really long time, I refused to watch anything that was multi-season because there's so
Yeah.
many long anime, and I want like some of my criteria were that they needed to be like single, sometimes even single season, or I would go to 2 seasons and had to be completed, like had very specific criteria for what I would watch. I am a little bit more lenient now, but One Piece is still such an undertaking. My sister loves it and she's watched it all in its entirety like 3 times or something unbelievable, but she's a huge fan. She's a much bigger anime fan than I am. Like when I talk about anime, like I said, most of my opinions are fairly generic because I only know the very like top of the genre. Like it's somebody who would come into booktube who knows that they like fantasy and they've read all the big names and they're not really sure where to go next. Like I have watched a fair amount of anime, but my sister is the kind of person who will know like what creators do what and who the voice actors are and the scores and like all of those different details that I would know about books, like the publishers and the cover artists and the trends and what's going to be big and what's the kind of like the sleeper hit, like all of those things about books is how she is with anime. So usually if I need a recommendation or information, I will get it from her.
Oh, that's cool. That's always nice to have that recommendation there for that kind of stuff. That's cool. Yeah, I think BookTube does a good job of putting more, manga and anime on my radar too,
Mhm.
fortunately, which is neat because, I mean, I even though Ranma is not one I would recommend. It was fun. I do remember, what's the other one? That famous movie. Oh, what is Spirited Away. Yeah,
Mhm,
that that's like one of my husband's favorite movies of all time. But I remember watching that too when I was younger.
mhm.
But I do remember I just loved anime in general, just like the idea of it and the art behind it. And I don't know, just the different culture that's not my own explored
Mhm.
in it. So I think it could be fun.
And you said you hadn't read Howl's Moving Castle. Does that mean you haven't watched Howl's Moving Castle either?
Mm-mm.
Oh, well,
No.
there out of the stream, that's the one thing that you need to take forward with you is you need to watch Howl's Moving Castle and then report
Would
back.
would you recommend that over reading it, or would you recommend watching the watching experience more?
I would say most people probably prefer the movie.
Oh, okay.
I like them both. But it might be, and this is how I feel about The Princess Bride. I loved Princess Bride the movie long before I ever read Princess
Me
Bride the
too.
book, and I
Mhm.
loved Howl's Moving Castle the movie before I ever read Howl's Moving Castle the book. So I like it, but I really, really love the. Oh no, it's not. I mean, obviously, if you find it boring, you find it boring. That's okay. But it's just so beautiful, and I really like it. You might not now, Joanna, but you can give it a try.
I may give it a try at some point. I think that'd be fun. Yeah. And Hunter. I've heard of it, but I've never seen it. This one. Uh, I did watch a movie back in the day, Vampire Hunter D. I think that one might be a popular one, or was at one point.
Mhm.
But honestly, there's just so much I don't even know about in that world. It's kind of still a new world to me.
That's true.
But yeah. But I did love that. I remember you did a video on recommending books if you like this anime. That was
I
fun.
love doing those videos. I have another one planned out. And like I said, those are the kind of videos that I love doing. Maybe 200 people will watch them, but those 200 people really like them and are like, talking about the anime and the books that they like and kind of matching things up on their own. So I think that that's fine. It's still really fun and I really like making them. So, and I have some ones that I have watched recently that have really reminded me of certain books. So I'm excited to record the newest one.
That's fun. Well, I love recommendation videos. I think those can always be fun to watch. And I have not watched Kiki's Delivery Service, but I know my husband loves that movie, and
Mhm.
everyone I know who has watched that movie absolutely loves it. So I don't know what the situation of that is. And I know Alan, who's no longer here in the chat, but he also loves, I think it's a different creator, but the Your Name, I think is the name of the movie, which is
Yes.
absolutely stunning. Absolutely stunning. Oh, cool.
Yeah, you will really like Princess Mononoke, I think, just
I
because you like
I've
the.
watched that. I think
Have
I've
you?
watched that. I think so. Yeah, I think so. I'm pretty sure I did. I don't really remember it. Like, I don't remember the details of what happened, but I watched it many, many, many years ago
Years ago.
with my
It's been a
friend.
really long time since I watched it too. I should really rewatch it.
Mhm.
Colton sent me an animated movie. It's called Wolf's Children. I don't remember the exact name, Colton, but it's about a mom and her two children. And I watched it with my husband, and it absolutely traumatized him. And he was like, I'm never watching anything that Colton tells you to watch ever again. And like days after we had finished the movie, he was like, I can't believe that I watched that. I can't believe that that happened. So it was really funny. Sword of the
Nice.
Stranger is really good. I like Sword of the Stranger too.
Is that it? So that's an anime or
It's a movie, animated
like a
movie.
movie? Okay, cool.
It has excellent fight scenes.
I've never
Yeah.
heard of this one, not Nausicaa of the Valley of the Winds, but another Studio Ghibli recommendation. That's pretty
Mhm.
cool. Yeah, you see a lot of that, um, Ghibli stuff in Japan, and even when I went to Epcot Center, there was, like, this Jap in the Japanese center of Epcot Center, there's a lot of Ghibli paraphernalia kinda stuff.
Yeah, I bought a lot of Sailor Moon merch.
Oh, yay! I've never watched Sailor Moon, like, I remember seeing it here and there on TV, but
Mhm.
I've always wanted to, and I never ever got to.
I
Um,
love Sailor
I've
Moon.
always
Love it,
wanted
love it.
to. I
I
had
watched
some
it
friends.
as a kid, so I used to
Mhm.
go to my babysitters, and as soon as I got home from school, like, that was the half an hour time slot that it was on in Canada, and then when I was in university, I think I talked about this a really long time ago, like in an early chat that I was having, maybe with Mike, like one of the first times that I talked to him is when I was dumped by my university boyfriend in like a
Mhm.
very not nice way.
I know this
My
story, Sarah, and it makes me want to cry.
my my parents felt really sad for me, so ordered me like the complete series of Sailor Moon online. And so that summer, as I was like, you know, feeling better, I was watching Sailor Moon at the same time. And it was just really nice. It did make me feel a lot better. And so then I watched it again as an adult. And I mean, it's different as an adult than as a child because it is an anime for, I think it's one that you appreciate more probably when you're younger, but it was still nice to watch it. The last season, actually, which I had not seen because it was never released in North America, was actually really good. I really enjoyed season 5.
Aw, that's something that I've always wanted. I don't know, like sometimes you have that nostalgic kind of childlike rainbows and unicorns wonder part of your
Mhm.
personality that you would just want to revisit sometimes. So I sometimes get this urge to go down that rabbit hole, even though I never watched it when I was younger. But yeah, that's I feel that way even with some middle grade fantasy I still haven't read. Like, for
Mhm.
example, I really want to something I've wanted to read for a long time is Keeper of the Lost Cities. It just seems so fun, and I
Mhm.
never make the time to read it because those books are so big, even though it's middle grade, but it just seems like super fun.
Absolutely. I still really enjoy middle grade. I have to say, finding a good middle grade fantasy is always fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have heard this. So I have never watched the Earthsea adaptation, and I have heard only terrible things
Oh,
about it.
no. Oh, no. Have you read
Mhm.
Earthsea? Or
Only the
you
first one.
haven't? Oh, you have? Okay.
Only the first one.
Ah, that's something I definitely need to get to at some point. My husband did read that too. He only read the first book, but he loved it. And that was another one where loved the prose style. And
Yeah, I can imagine if he enjoys prose that he would
he
probably
does. It really surprises me. I'm like, where did
Mhm.
that come from? Because I feel like I don't know. I at least when I started reading fantasy, I just wasn't that picky about it. And then
Mhm.
now that's slowly changed, but
Mhm.
it's taken a lot of reading for me to get there. And for him, he just naturally was like, "Oh yeah, I don't like this prose style. Oh, I like this." And I'm like, "What? You're not even much of a fantasy reader." Aw, thank you so much. Yay. I don't know what that is, but I believe you. All right, cool. Well, we've been going on for about 3 hours and 15 minutes. So I think that's a pretty good amount of time, and I've really appreciated this conversation, Sarah.
Thank
So,
you for having me. It was really fun.
yeah, well, thank you so much. And thank you everyone in the chat for joining us. Um, I know I need to get some sleep. My brain kind of shuts off at 9 p.m.
Oh my gosh,
and
it's
I
like
don't know what I'm
10
saying
minutes
after
to
that.
midnight here.
So it is kind of late for me, but but I've had a great time. So I'm really glad to have this conversation. I always enjoy these discussions, and I'm really glad that Sarah and I got to have a one-on-one because I have been in a couple of group chats with you before, but I've never just gotten to chat with you one-on-one before. So
Yes,
this,
it was really fun.
yeah, so it's great. So thank you all so so much, and I hope you all are having a great night. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll talk to you soon. All right, bye bye.